There is a moment in the very first episode of Gravity Falls where a boy named Dipper Pines is sent into the woods to put up signs for his great uncle's tourist trap, and inside a hollow metal tree he finds a leather-bound book with a six-fingered hand on the cover and a gold number 3. He opens it, and almost immediately the book tells him that nothing in this town is what it appears to be, that something is hiding behind the kindly faces and the pine trees and the cheap roadside attractions, and that whoever wrote the book had to stop writing because something out there was hunting them. The show spent 2 seasons and 40 episodes proving that book right, hiding answers inside ciphers, inside credit stills, inside throwaway gags, inside the eyes of side characters who turned out to matter, and almost nobody you know has ever sat through every single mystery from beginning to end. Tonight we are going through all of it, every secret the show planted and then quietly answered, from the smallest hidden detail to the largest cosmic question. The journals, the portal, the brothers, Bill Cipher, the Cipher wheel, the axolotl, and the slow, gentle ending where a summer that lasted forever finally has to end. This is Pine Hat. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed, it really does help us keep making these. Let us start with the town itself, because everything else in Gravity Falls grows out of the ground it stands on. Gravity Falls is a small, sleepy-looking town in the deep woods of Oregon, all log cabins and gravel roads and a single weather diner, the kind of place where the local newspaper still runs by the week and the sheriff knows everyone by their first name. On the surface, it is the most ordinary American small town you could draw, and that is exactly the trick the show is playing, because the show keeps quietly insisting that there is nothing ordinary about this place at all. The pine trees that ring the valley are not just decorative. The valley itself sits inside a kind of bowl, and the bowl, as Dipper figures out fairly early on, is not a natural geological feature. It is more like a scar. Something happened here a long time before the Pines twins ever arrived, and the town has been growing on top of it ever since. The series implies again and again that the town is a kind of magnet for the strange. Gnomes live in the trees, a lake monster lurks in the water, a coven of manitors has built a cave system in the cliffs, a society of body-swapping shapeshifters lives in the mines. There is a haunted convenience store, a haunted carpet, a haunted wax museum, a sentient mailbox in the woods, and a flock of eye creatures that follow you home if you do not look away in time. None of this is treated as remarkable by the locals. They are used to it. They have always been used to it. And that is the first real mystery of Gravity Falls. The question that hangs over the entire show before any of the larger plot has even started to move. Why here? Why this town? Why this valley? The answer the show eventually gives, in pieces across both seasons, is that the valley itself was created by something falling. A long time ago, something cosmic and powerful crashed into this part of the world, and the impact tore open a thin spot between dimensions. And ever since then, reality in Gravity Falls has been just a little softer than it is supposed to be. Strange creatures slip through. Strange ideas hold for longer than they should. The laws of physics and the laws of stories bend a little when no one is looking. The town settled on top of it without ever quite knowing what was underneath, and the show treats that the way an old folk song treats a haunted hill, as something everyone half knows and nobody quite wants to say out loud. That is the soil the whole rest of the lore grows out of. Every journal, every monster, every cipher, every cosmic horror in the finale, all of it stands on the simple fact that this particular patch of Oregon is not quite stitched into the rest of the universe the way it should be. You can almost feel the town breathing in the wide, quiet shots at sunset, the way the trees lean in, the way the wind moves through the satellite dishes on the old water tower. The series does not need to tell you anything is wrong. The town tells you, just by being so quiet, that something is sleeping under it and that something has been sleeping for a very long time. Into this town, in the very first scene of the very first episode, come Dipper and Mabel Pines, 12-year-old twins from somewhere in California, sent up to Oregon for the summer to stay with their great uncle Stan because their parents wanted them out of the house and Stan needed cheap labor for his tourist trap. That is how the show frames it, anyway. And that is how the kids understand it. But the longer you watch, the more obvious it becomes that the arrangement was not actually random. Stan does not have grandchildren. Stan does not have close family. Stan has lived alone in the woods for 30 years running a shack full of fake monsters. And the show eventually gives you a fairly clear reason for that, but in the meantime here arrive these two children. Sharp-eyed Dipper with his pine tree hat and his quiet anxieties, sparkling Mabel with her sweaters and her boundless appetite for the world, and they walk into a house that has been waiting for something for decades. You can read the whole show if you want as the story of what happens when a house that has been waiting finally gets the visitors it needed. Dipper is, by fan accounting, the older of the two by a handful of minutes, a fact he never quite lets Mabel forget, and that she ignores entirely, and from the first second he is the cautious one, the one who reads, the one who keeps a list, the one who tries to keep his sister from doing something dangerous and usually fails. Mabel is the engine of the show, almost literally, the one whose enthusiasm pulls the plot into motion. She wants a summer romance, she wants a pet, she wants a sweater for every mood, she wants a band, she wants a movie, and the show keeps giving her these things in distorted, slightly cursed forms, and she keeps loving them anyway. The bond between the two of them is the emotional axis the entire show rotates around. Every cosmic horror, every dimensional rip, every con man uncle, every reformed villain, all of it ultimately ties back to the question of whether these two kids will still be the same kind of close by the end of the summer that they were at the start. And that question, the show argues quietly, is actually the biggest mystery of the whole series. The supernatural stuff is the surface. The bond is the foundation. You can feel it in the way the show frames them, almost always together in frame, almost always touching, leaning, sharing a couch, sharing a hammock, sharing a glance across a room when something has gone strange. The summer they are spending in Gravity Falls is, the show keeps insisting, the last summer they will ever spend like this, because they are turning 13 at the end of it, and 13 is the doorway out of being a child, and the show treats that doorway with the same kind of cosmic weight it gives to the dimensional rift under the town. Both of them are inevitable. Both of them are coming whether you want them to or not. And the genius of the writing is that those two endings, the supernatural and the personal, end up being the same ending. The summer ending and the world almost ending happen in the same week. You cannot separate them. The show will not let you. Now consider the third Pines who is already living in the town when they arrive, the man they call Grunkle Stan, short for Great Uncle, who is presented to you in the first episode as a wrinkled, money-obsessed con man in a red fez who runs a tacky museum of badly stuffed monsters and overcharges tourists for everything from snow globes to bathroom passes. Stan is one of the most carefully constructed characters in modern children's television, and the show is playing a very long game with him from the very first scene. Almost everything he says in the first season is technically a lie, or at least a partial lie, and the writers plant the evidence for that in plain sight if you are willing to go back and rewatch. There are documents on the walls he glances at in panic. There are scenes where he disappears into a hidden room at night and you see only the back of his head as something glows. There is a photo on his desk in the very first episode that becomes one of the most significant single images in the entire series, but the camera lingers on it for less than a second and almost no first-time viewer notices. Stan calls himself Stan Pines, but the man on his birth certificate is not exactly that. He runs the Mystery Shack as a tourist trap, but the shack is sitting on top of one of the most important pieces of supernatural technology in the show, and he knows it. He barely talks about his past, and the few times he does, he tells the kids different stories, and none of them are quite right. The viewer is supposed to read him as a slightly comic, slightly grumpy old uncle for an entire season and a half. And then the show is going to pull the rug out from under that reading in one of the most carefully foreshadowed reveals in any animated show of the last 20 years. Everything you think you know about Grunkle Stan in the first season is set up to be revised. The man you are watching is, the show eventually tells you, not the man whose name is on the deed of the house he lives in. The man whose name is on that deed is missing. He has been missing for 30 years. And the man you have been watching has spent every single one of those 30 years quietly trying to bring him back. That is the second mystery of Gravity Falls, layered right on top of the first. The town is sitting on a rift. The shack is sitting on a portal. And the man running the shack is not exactly who he says he is. The Mystery Shack itself is a character. It is a leaning, peeling wood and shingle building stuck into a clearing in the woods with an enormous sign on the roof that has lost its first letter so half the time it reads as Mystery Hack instead, which is a small visual joke the show makes about its owner without saying it out loud. Stan bought the property 30 years before the show begins and turned it into a tourist trap, charging admission to look at obviously fake exhibits, the jackalope, the Sasquatch hand, the 8.5 President of the United States, all of it scrawled together out of paint and old taxidermy. The shack runs on cheap labor. The cashier and handyman, a soft-hearted young man called Seuss, who has worked there for years and considers Stan a kind of substitute father, is paid almost nothing and does almost everything. The clerk behind the counter is a 15-year-old redhead called Wendy Corduroy, who is technically employed but mostly spends her shifts reading magazines and avoiding her father. And the gift shop sells the kind of bumper stickers and snow globes that wear their irony on their sleeves. From the outside, it is a small business slowly going bankrupt. From the inside, once you start looking, it is something else entirely. There is a vending machine in the gift shop that does not actually vend anything. There is a study upstairs that Stan keeps locked at all hours. There is a basement nobody is allowed to visit, and a sub-basement under that one nobody is supposed to know exists. The wires running under the floorboards are not normal household wires. The hum the shack makes at night if you stop talking long enough to hear it is not the hum a wooden building should make. The series plants all of this from the first season onward as background detail. And an enormous part of the pleasure of rewatching Gravity Falls comes from noticing how many of these little details were already there before you knew they meant anything. The thing the shack is really hiding is a portal, an enormous triangular dimension-breaking machine built into the rock under the foundation, with cables thick as tree trunks running up into the walls. And the whole tourist trap above it is essentially a disguise. Stan built the disguise on purpose. He needed somewhere to live, somewhere to make money, somewhere to keep prying eyes away from what was actually downstairs, and a roadside attraction was, frankly, perfect for the job. People come, they laugh, they pay, they leave, and they never look up at the wires or down at the floor. The Mystery Shack is the longest-running con in the show, and most of the people fooled by it are sitting in the living room every night, eating cereal out of the box, watching reruns of a fake detective show with the man whose secret they have not yet figured out. That brings us to the journals, because they are the next mystery the show layers on top of the town and the shack and the man in the fez. There are 3 of them. They are leather-bound, gold-edged, and on the cover of each one is a stylist 6-fingered hand with a Roman numeral inside the palm. Journal 1, Journal 2, Journal 3. They were written by the same person, the same handwriting, the same obsessive ink diagrams of the monsters and anomalies and dangers of the valley, and they were hidden, one by one, in different places around the town when the writer realized that something he had trusted had betrayed him. Dipper finds Journal 3 in the woods in the very first episode, inside that hollow metal tree, and from that moment the journal is essentially his closest companion for the rest of the first season. He carries it everywhere. He reads it under blankets at night with a flashlight. He uses it to identify monsters, to plan responses, to understand what is happening to him and his sister. The writing is in a kind of urgent, half-panicked, field notebook style, mixing diagrams and personal asides and warnings written in increasingly cracked handwriting, and the further Dipper reads, the more obvious it becomes that whoever wrote the journal was, by the end of it, no longer entirely well. The author keeps warning about a figure he calls Trust No One. The author keeps warning that he has been deceived, that he was helping something he should not have been helping, that he is going to hide the journals and run, and the journal cuts off mid-sentence. It is one of the most evocative pieces of show fiction in any animated series of its era, and the writers keep Dipper, and you, away from the question of who wrote it for as long as they possibly can. Journal 2 surfaces relatively early, in the hands of a child psychic called Gideon Gleeful, who runs his own competing tent show on the other side of town, and who, the moment he realizes Dipper has Journal 3, becomes obsessed with collecting all of them. Gideon, we eventually learn, found his copy by accident, and he wants the others because he understands, on some level, what the 3 of them together can do. Journal 1 stays hidden for almost the entire show. It is the one nobody has, the one whose location the writer guarded most closely, the one that contains, the show eventually tells us, the most personal and most dangerous of the author's notes, his earliest research. before he understood what he was getting into. When all 3 journals are finally brought together in the middle of the 2nd season, they slot into a hidden mechanism inside the shack that opens a passage to the sub-basement and the portal underneath. The journals, in other words, are not just diaries. They are a key. 3 parts of a key, separated on purpose by the man who wrote them, so that no one person could open the door he had spent years trying to close. That tells you almost everything you need to know about the writer before you ever see his face. He built the door. He used it. He understood, too late, that what came through it should never have been let in. And then he split the key into 3 pieces and scattered them across the town, hoping that whoever found them would not be foolish enough to put them back together. The whole structure of the show is in that decision. He hoped. He could not be sure. He left a trail of warnings, and somewhere in the back of his mind he knew that the warnings, in the right hands, would only make the door more tempting. The identity of the writer is the next great mystery the show takes its time answering. Dipper spends almost the entire 1st season treating the author as a kind of distant, almost mythical figure. A brilliant scientist who once walked these woods and cataloged their horrors and then vanished, leaving only the journals behind. There are early hints. The handwriting in the journal is slightly familiar in a way Dipper cannot quite place. The 6-fingered hand on the cover keeps reappearing, on doors, on machinery, on a particular cracked photograph that sits on Grunkle Stan's desk if you look at it long enough. The author signs nothing, leaves no name, no first initial, only a kind of trembling note here and there that the work is killing him. Dipper, who is a researcher by temperament, builds up a portrait of this person in his head over the course of the 1st season, and the portrait is essentially the portrait of who Dipper wants to be when he grows up. Brilliant, disciplined, brave, a note keeper, a monster hunter, someone who would walk into the woods alone with a notebook and come back with the truth. The show is doing something careful with this, and you can see it in retrospect. Dipper is building an idol, and the show is going to make him meet his idol, and the meeting is going to be more complicated than he wants it to be. The author, the show eventually reveals, is a man called Stanford Pines, born with 12 fingers, the result of a polydactyl gene that ran in the Pines family, the same family Grunkle Stan and the twins belong to. Stanford is Stan's brother. Stanford is in fact Stan's twin. The 2 of them grew up together in a small East Coast fishing town, sharing a bedroom above a pawn shop run by their father, sharing a bunk bed, sharing a small handmade boat called the Stan O'War that they planned to sail around the world together as adults. Their childhood, the show eventually tells us in a long flashback episode that almost every fan agrees is one of the best episodes the show ever made, was the kind of close that twin childhoods can be when nothing in the wider world has yet pulled the 2 of them apart. They were inseparable. They were each other's only real ally against a difficult father and a distracted mother, and they were. In their own different ways, brilliant, Stanford was the academic one, the obsessive reader, the one who built improbably ambitious science fair projects out of scrap. Stanley was the loud one, the brawler, the one who got into fights on the boardwalk and came home with bloody knuckles and a grin. They balanced each other. They needed each other. And then, one night in their last year of high school, Stanley, by accident or by something a little harder to define, broke the model for Stanford's most important science fair project, the one that was going to get him into a prestigious university, the one that was going to take him out of the town for good. The model broke. The project failed. The university did not take Stanford. Their father, furious, threw Stanley out of the house. The 2 brothers separated. They did not speak for years. What happened between that night and the start of the show is one of the great long-form character backstories in animated television. Stanford went to a different university, a smaller one called Backupsmore by the show's own canon, and there, working alone in a basement lab, he became fascinated by anomalies, by the cracks and edge cases and unexplained phenomena that mainstream science politely ignored, and he made it his life's project to find a place where reality was strangest, and to study it. He found Gravity Falls. He moved there as a young man. The show is a little vague about exactly when, and he built himself a cabin in the woods, and he began the journals. For years he worked alone, cataloging the gnomes and the manitors and the lake monster and all the rest, filling page after page with sketches and warnings and questions. And then something started talking to him in his dreams. a small, friendly, charismatic voice in the shape of a triangle, who introduced himself as a muse, who flattered Stanford's intelligence, who praised his work, who offered him knowledge no human had ever had access to. This is the figure called Bill Cipher, and we are going to spend a lot of time on him later, but for now what matters is that Stanford believed him. Stanford trusted him. Stanford let this voice into his work, took his advice, accepted his blueprints, and built, over years, the enormous interdimensional portal under what would later become the Mystery Shack. Stanford was, the show tells us, trying to do something good. He thought the portal would be a window onto truths beyond human imagining. He thought he was working with a benevolent guide. He was wrong on both counts. When he finally understood what Bill actually was, and what the portal was actually for, it was too late to undo most of the work, and the only person on Earth Stanford could think to call for help was the brother he had not spoken to in years. He called Stanley. Stanley came. They fought, more or less immediately, and during the fight, Stanley, in a moment of anger or grief or something between them, pushed Stanford into the activated portal. Stanford fell through, the portal stayed open just long enough to take him, and then it sealed shut. And Stanley was left standing in the basement, alone, looking at a dimensional gateway he did not know how to operate, with 3 journals and a brother trapped on the other side. What he did next is in some ways the moral spine of the entire show. Stanley Pines, who had been a wandering con man, a small-time thief, a drifter with no fixed address, took his brother's identity. He shaved differently, he wore his brother's clothes, he forged his brother's signature, he answered to his brother's name. He took over the cabin, he built the tourist trap around it so that he would have an income and a reason to keep prying eyes away, and he spent 30 years working in the sub-basement night after night, trying to repair and reactivate the machine that had taken his brother away. He did not have a degree. He did not have a scientific background. He was teaching himself alone from his brother's journals in fits and starts for 30 years. That is the man you are watching when the show begins. That is the man behind the fez and the cane and the wisecracks. He is not a tourist trap owner. He is the most patient, most stubborn, most quietly desperate brother in any animated show of the last 20 years, and he has been waiting, alone in that house, for 30 years, for a chance to bring his brother home. The episode where this is finally revealed, in the middle of the 2nd season, is one of the most carefully built emotional gut punches in the show, and the long flashback episode that follows it, the one called A Tale of Two Stans, is the one almost every fan will point to as the moment the show becomes more than a children's adventure. It is, on rewatch, a slow domestic tragedy hiding inside a tourist trap, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. Every grumpy line, every cheap joke, every con Stan pulls in the early episodes is the cover story of a man who has been mourning his brother for 3 decades without ever once telling anyone. The portal itself deserves its own long look. Because of all the pieces of supernatural technology in the show, it is the most consequential. The one whose opening and closing essentially shapes everything that happens to the Pines family across 2 seasons. The portal is enormous, taller than the house above it, a black-framed triangular doorway built into a chamber carved out of the bedrock under the shack, surrounded by walkways and consoles and great looping cables that pulse with a hostile green light when it is running. The show is careful to never quite tell you exactly how it works, which is probably the right choice for a children's adventure show, but the broad strokes are clear enough. The portal is a hole between dimensions. It does not so much travel through space as cut through the membrane between universes. And what it lets through can come from anywhere, any when, any reality. When Stanford built it. Working from the dreamscape blueprints he had been receiving from the figure in his dreams, he believed it was a window onto knowledge, a peephole into the larger multiverse, a tool for understanding. What he did not understand at the time, and what Bill never told him, was that the portal was being designed not to look through, but to break through. That the structure of it was specifically intended to tear a permanent rift between the dimensions if it ever ran at full power for long enough, and that the rift, once opened, would allow Bill and the things that lived in Bill's home dimension to enter ours. Stanford only realized this in the final stages of construction, and his response, in the journals, is one of the most chilling sequences in the entire show. He shuts the project down, he tries to dismantle what he can, He hides the journals. He stops sleeping because Bill can only reach him in his dreams, and Stanford knows by then that he can no longer trust anything Bill has told him. The episode where this is dramatized in flashback is genuinely upsetting in a way Disney children's television rarely allows itself to be. Stanford is alone in his cabin, lights blazing, drinking coffee, talking to nothing, sketching protective symbols on the floor, the picture of a man losing his grip on a reality he no longer trusts. When Stanley arrives in answer to his desperate postcard, Stanford is on the brink, and the fight that follows, the one that ends with Stanley pushing his brother into the portal, is not so much a reasoned argument as a collision of two terrified people who have not seen each other in years and who do not have the time to slow down and understand each other. The portal takes Stanford, and the portal stays closed, and the door between dimensions seals itself, more or less, for 30 years. The Mystery Shack is built around it. Tourists walk over it every day for 3 decades, never knowing that the floor under their feet is the lid of a dimensional gateway. And in the sub-basement, Stanley keeps working, learning, repairing, rebuilding, slowly figuring out the machine without ever once being trained for it. By the time the show begins, the machine is almost ready. By the time the show reaches the end of the first season, Stanley is putting the final pieces together. By the time the middle of the second season arrives and the 3 journals are at last brought together inside the shack and slotted into the hidden mechanism that gives the portal its full power, the door is ready to be opened again. Stanley pushes the button. Dipper and Mabel, who do not yet understand what is happening, watch the lights blaze and the green glow spread and the floor shake, and a figure walks out of the portal carrying a rifle on his shoulder and pulls his hood back and reveals a face that is almost identical to Grunkle Stan's, only younger, sharper, with 12 fingers and a streak of gray in his hair. Stanford Pines, the author of the journals, has come home, and nothing in the show is the same after that. The man who walks back into the shack after 30 years away is not the same man who walked into the portal. He has been wandering across dimensions for 3 decades, fighting and hiding and surviving, and he has accumulated a fair amount of paranoia and a fair amount of skill. He carries weapons he has built himself. He has plates of armor under his coat. He has been hunted by Bill's agents through more universes than he can count, and the long absence has changed him in ways that are not always easy to watch. He is suspicious of Stanley, even though Stanley spent 30 years trying to bring him back. He is dismissive of the children at first, although he warms to them slowly, especially to Dipper, who reminds him painfully of himself at 12. He is fiercely intelligent and fiercely lonely, and he carries with him the certainty that Bill is coming back, that the rift in reality is not yet closed, that the worst of what he started in this town has not yet happened. He is also, in many ways, exactly the figure Dipper had been building in his head from the journals, and the show is careful about how it handles the moment Dipper realizes this. Dipper is thrilled at first to meet the author. He wants to be Stanford's apprentice. He wants to leave the family business with Stan and stay in Gravity Falls and study anomalies under his hero. And the show does not entirely punish him for this, because Stanford is a hero in his own complicated way. But the writing also makes you sit with the discomfort of watching a 12-year-old turn slightly away from the great uncle who raised him for the summer in favor of a man who can offer him a more glamorous future. The triangle between Stan and Stanford and Dipper is one of the quietest, most painful subplots in the second half of the show, and it is the kind of writing that almost never happens in a Disney show aimed at children. Stanford does not particularly want to forgive Stanley. Stanley does not particularly know how to apologize. Dipper does not understand why his 2 great uncles cannot just be in the same room together. And underneath all of it, the rift in reality, the one Stanford warned about, is widening, and Bill, the small triangle in the dreamscape, is finally about to break through. So now we have to talk about Bill Cipher, because almost every other mystery in the show in the end is downstream of him. Bill is a yellow triangle with one eye in the middle and a small top hat and a black bow tie, and he speaks in a high, fast, gleeful voice that almost always sounds like he is doing you a favor by talking to you. He appears in the show for the first time, very briefly, inside the dream of one of the side characters in the first season, and even there he behaves the way he behaves later, all charm and flattery and casual cruelty, treating the dream he has invaded as a stage for his own little performance. Bill is, by his own account, an interdimensional being of pure energy, a creature that exists outside of time and outside of any single universe, and he is the closest thing the show has to a god. He sees everyone. He knows almost everything. He can enter dreams. He can possess bodies under the right conditions. He can rewrite the laws of physics inside a limited region of space if he is allowed to take a foothold in a stable reality. He is, the show eventually argues, one of the most powerful beings in any animated children's series of the last 20 years. And he is also, almost from the first moment he appears, one of the most chillingly charming villains. He sings, he jokes, he makes friends, he plays card games with his victims while he is destroying their lives. He treats murder and possession and the end of the world with the cheerfulness of a salesman closing a deal. The voice work on Bill is the kind of performance that becomes the entire character, and the show uses him sparingly enough across the first season that by the time he becomes a full-time antagonist in the second season, the air is already thick with him whenever he turns up. The show implies, although it never quite fully confirms in the original run, that Bill's home dimension is a kind of two-dimensional, flat, geometric world where shapes have minds and lives, and that something terrible happened there a long time ago. Something Bill himself was responsible for, that left him without a home and without anything left to lose. The Book of Bill, the canon tie-in book published in the years after the show ended, leans much harder into this and gives a much fuller account of Bill's origin than the show itself ever quite did, but even just inside the show you can sense it. In the way Bill talks about his dimension, in the way he refers obliquely to fire and to ruin, and to a family that is not there anymore. By most accounts, Bill is a refugee from a world he himself burned down, and he has spent however long he has been alive looking for a stable, three-dimensional reality to break into and turn into a version of the world he lost. Our dimension, with its soft spot in Oregon and its careless physicist building a portal in his basement, was the one that finally let him in. What Bill actually wants is a question the show takes a while to answer, and the answer, when it comes, is both simpler and stranger than first-time viewers tend to expect. Bill does not want power in the way most cartoon villains want power. He is not after money, or land, or a throne in any conventional sense. What he wants is a permanent foothold in our reality, a stable bridge between dimensions through which his own kind can enter so that he can remake the physical universe in the shape of his home dimension, where minds without bodies float free, where shapes and ideas have lives, where the rules of physics are negotiable, where time is a suggestion. The show calls this Weirdmageddon, although Bill himself uses the more grandiose term. And the argument the writers are making, very gently, is that what Bill is offering is not exactly destruction, it is conversion. He wants to convert our universe into his universe, to dissolve the boundary between the two, to let the dreaming world spill into the waking one and stay there. To Bill, this is an improvement. To us, it is the end of everything. And the way he plans to do it is, of course, through the portal under the shack, which is not just a door, but a wedge, a structure that can pry the dimensions apart if it is run at full power for long enough. The cracking of the rift, when the portal finally fires for too long at the end of the first half of the second season, is the moment Bill has been waiting for. From that point on, in the back half of the second season, Bill is no longer a guest in dreams. He is a presence in the physical world. He can act through agents, he can possess, he can break things, he can change them, and he is patient. Much more patient than the children watching expect a cartoon villain to be, because he has been waiting, by his own account, for a very long time. The show treats him, in the end, as something between a trickster god and a slow apocalypse, and it earns that treatment with how carefully it builds him across 2 seasons. He is a joke at first. He is a presence next. He is a threat after that. And then, in the back half of the second season, he becomes the weather. The mechanics of his power, the things he can and cannot do, are worth picking apart, because the show is careful about them. In the early appearances, Bill is essentially limited to the dreamscape. He can enter someone's dreams, he can negotiate deals with them, he can take over their body if they shake his hand in a dream and agree to it, and the possession in the body lasts for as long as he has hold of it. The show dramatizes this in the second season episode where Bill possesses Dipper in exchange for help finding a hidden journal, and the body, after a while, starts to break down. Bill is not careful with his vessels. He bruises them, He overworks them, he starves them, he does not understand or care that the human body is a delicate thing. The possession is reversible in that one case because of a clever bit of teamwork between Dipper and Mabel, but the show makes you watch a possessed 12-year-old put his own hand through a window and beat himself up in front of a mirror, and the scene is unsettling in exactly the way the writers intended. Bill is a friend who will laugh at you for screaming while he hurts you. Bill is a god who finds humans funny. Bill is the kind of villain who calls you kid and pats you on the head while he is preparing to ruin everything you love. The show is very, very careful that you should never forget what he is, no matter how much you find yourself laughing at his jokes. Before Bill ever became Stanford's muse, there was a man in Gravity Falls who served as his first human partner. And that man, the show eventually reveals, is the same old hermit you have been seeing across the entire first season as a comic relief figure, the cracked, raving, banjo-playing oddity called Old Man McGucket. McGucket appears in the early episodes as a kind of running joke, a gray-bearded wild man in tatty overalls who lives in the local junkyard, who shouts nonsense at the moon, who builds giant robots out of trash and uses them to climb up onto the water tower and yell about the end of the world. It is, on first watch, easy to file him as a background gag. The show is going to pull that rug out from under you as carefully as it pulled the rug out from under Stan. McGucket, in his younger days, was a brilliant computer scientist and engineer, by most accounts a college friend of Stanford from his backup-more years, and he was the man Stanford Pines hired to help him build the portal. With his engineering background, McGucket was the one who actually constructed much of the machinery, the one who soldered the circuits and ran the wires and welded the great triangular frame into the bedrock under the cabin. He was Stanford's first true friend in the town, his lab partner, and for a brief period in the years before the portal went wrong, he was happy in a way he had not been since he was a young man. And then, he saw what came through. The portal, in its early test runs, briefly opened a window onto another dimension, and McGucket was the one in the chamber when something on the other side reached out and looked back at him. The show implies, although it never quite states, that whatever McGucket saw broke something in him. He retreated. He quit. He fled the project. He could not stand to remember any of it, and he found or invented a way to remove the memory from his own mind. A mechanical helmet that could erase specific memories from a person's consciousness, leaving nothing but the residue of a feeling. He used the helmet on himself. He used it again and again. He erased not just the portal, not just Stanford, but more and more of his life over the years, in a desperate attempt to forget what he had seen and what he had helped to build. And every time he used the helmet, he came out a little less coherent, a little less of a person, a little more of the cracked figure you meet in the first season of the show. The old man McGucket you laugh at in the early episodes is a man who has eaten his own brain piece by piece, on purpose, because the alternative was unbearable. The episode where Dipper and Mabel finally figure this out is one of the unexpectedly heaviest hours of the show, and it widens out into another whole layer of the lore, because McGucket was not alone in his memory wiping. Once you have a machine that can erase specific memories from a person's mind, you have an enormously powerful tool, and someone, or some people, in Gravity Falls turned that tool into the central instrument of a small, secret organization called the Society of the Blind Eye. The Society is a hooded order of locals who operate out of a hidden chamber under the museum, and what they do is essentially manage the trauma of the town. People who see something they should not have seen. People who stumble onto a supernatural truth too horrible to live with. People who simply cannot keep functioning in their lives after a night in the woods are brought in front of the society and have their memories erased. The members see themselves as helpers. They believe they are doing a kindness. They believe that the town would be a wasteland of broken minds if not for them. And the show is careful enough not to entirely dismiss that view, even as it makes very clear that what they are doing is also a violation. The society's leader is a man with very personal reasons to want particular memories erased from particular people, and the show pulls this off as a fairly clean little mystery within the episode, with a satisfying reveal. The wider point, though, lasts longer. The town has been actively unweaving its own knowledge of itself for years. Everyone in Gravity Falls who has ever come close to the truth has had the truth taken out of them by the Society of the Blind Eye. That is one of the reasons the locals seem so blasé about the weirdness around them. They are not unbothered. They are continuously edited. When Dipper and Mabel finally find the Society's machine and destroy it at the end of that episode, McGucket gets back some of what he lost. In pieces. He starts to remember. He remembers, slowly, that he was once an engineer, that he once worked for a man named Ford, that he once helped to build something he should not have built. The arc the show gives McGucket from that point on is one of the most quietly redemptive arcs of any character in the series. He cleans himself up. He starts to think again. He starts to use his old engineering brain to help the people he had wronged. By the end of the show, in one of the small but unmistakable closing beats, he is no longer the man on the water tower, and the Society of the Blind Eye is no more. That gives us, by the middle of the second season, a small but important group of people in the town who know more or less what is actually going on, and another, much larger, group who have been kept from knowing on purpose. The series keeps these two groups carefully separated, and you can map the entire emotional architecture of the second half of the show by which characters cross over from the second group into the first. Wendy Corduroy, the teenage cashier at the shack, finds out fairly late, and the show plays her reaction beautifully, somewhere between exhausted and amused, the way a 15-year-old in Oregon might react to being told that the woods she has been camping in her entire life are actually a buffer zone against an interdimensional eldritch invasion. Seuss, the handyman, finds out a little earlier, and his response is essentially loyalty. Of course there is a portal under the shack. Of course Mr. Pines has been keeping a secret. Of course Seuss will still work the register tomorrow. The town as a whole does not find out until the very end, when the truth essentially comes for the town all at once and there is no longer any way to hide it. And that in turn is the moment the Society's project of careful editing finally collapses. Because there is no machine in the world that can erase a memory the size of what comes next. While all of this is being slowly laid out underneath the surface of the show, another mystery is running in parallel across the first season, one that masquerades as a much smaller, much more childish kind of villain plot, and that is the entire arc of Gideon Gleeful. Gideon is a tiny, fluffy-haired, white-suited child psychic, a few years older than the twins, who runs his own competing tourist trap across town under the name Gideon's Tent of Telepathy, where for a small admission fee the audience can watch him perform what looks like genuine clairvoyance, complete with floating chairs, mind reading, and the levitation of audience members. His father is his loud, abusive, hectoring stage manager. His mother is a meek figure in a sweater who is always offering him something to eat. He is, in the early episodes, played essentially as a comic antagonist for Stan, a rival businessman who hates the Mystery Shack and wants it gone. The show keeps him at that level long enough to lull you into a certain expectation, and then, very carefully, complicates him. Gideon's psychic powers, you eventually realize, are not entirely fake. He has a little bit of real ability, a kind of low-grade telepathy, and the source of that ability is the second journal, the one he discovered by accident as a child and has been quietly studying ever since. Inside the journal is a description of a particular amulet, a polished green gemstone set in silver, that allows the wearer to move objects with their mind, and Gideon has built his entire stage act around it, hiding it under his lapel during shows and using it to do the actual levitating while he performs the fake mind reading. He is, in other words, the first character in the show who has used the journals to grasp real supernatural power, and he has used that power to build a fan club, a cash flow, and a kind of cult of personality in the town. He is also, the show makes very clear, a deeply lonely child raised by a deeply manipulative father, and the writing gives him just enough genuine sympathy that you cannot quite write him off as a one-note villain. He develops an unrequited and increasingly disturbing crush on Mabel. He tries to charm her. He tries to date her. When she refuses, he turns the full force of his obsession outward, against her and against her family, and the front half of the first season is shaped, in large part, by him trying to take the Mystery Shack away from Stan and turn it into his own headquarters. Because he understands, on some level, that the Shack is hiding something he wants very badly. By the end of the first season, in one of the show's first proper escalations, Gideon has acquired a giant robot, gone to war with the Pines family, lost, and been arrested, but during the fight he steals Journal 3 from Dipper, who only gets it back at the cost of his own near defeat. He is the first character to demonstrate, on screen, what one of the journals in the wrong hands can actually do, and his arc is a kind of dress rehearsal for the much larger and much more terrifying use the journals will eventually be put to in the second season. Gideon's prison arc in the second season is also where the show pulls another quiet reveal, because while he is in jail he becomes, briefly, an ally of Bill Cipher, and the way that alliance is constructed gives us our first proper sense of how Bill recruits human servants. Bill does not appear to Gideon in a dream. He speaks to him through the radio, through reflections, through the painted eye on the door of the cell. He flatters him. He commiserates with him. He offers him power. Gideon, who is a much sadder figure in the second season than in the first, accepts and becomes Bill's first proper agent inside the town. The show uses this to demonstrate that Bill's reach extends well beyond the dreamscape, that he has been working other people while he was working Stanford, and that he has been planting little hooks in the town for a very long time. By the time Bill's actual physical entry into our reality is ready, he already has a small handful of agents in place. Gideon is one. The Henchmaniacs, the gang of two-dimensional creatures from his home dimension who eventually arrive with him at the start of Weirdmageddon, are the others. The show is not arbitrary about who has been talking to him. Every one of them is a person with a grievance, a person who feels cheated by the world, a person who has been told they were destined for better and never quite got it. Bill collects the disappointed. He recruits the resentful. The series is fairly clear, if you watch it carefully, that this is a deliberate strategy on his part. He cannot enter our world by force, at least not yet, and so he works on its weak points, the way water works on a rock. Gideon, for all his early role as a comic villain, is essentially the first crack the water finds. Then there are the Northwests. Pacifica Northwest, the rich blonde girl who is Mabel's rival in the first season, is presented to you as a one-note mean girl, the cheap heir to the founding family of the town, the kind of antagonist most cartoons would simply leave as a one-note antagonist for the entire series. The show eventually does something much more interesting with her, and the most interesting thing it does involves the secret history of her family. The Northwests, you are told very early on, are the most important family in Gravity Falls. They founded the town. They built the manor on the hill. They have a portrait of their patriarch, Nathaniel Northwest, hanging in the town hall. They host the most exclusive party of the year. Pacifica wears it like a coat. Her parents weaponize it against her, controlling her with a literal small bell that they ring whenever she says something unrefined. A detail the show drops in casually, and that is genuinely one of the more disturbing background gags of the second season. The episode where the real secret of the Northwests comes out, in the middle of the second season, is structured as a haunted house story, with Dipper and Pacifica trapped inside the Northwest Manor on the night of the family's annual party, while a vengeful spirit destroys the building room by room. The spirit, it turns out, is the ghost of a lumberjack who was promised, generations earlier, that the Northwests would open the doors of their manor to the people of the town once a year as thanks for the labor the town had given to build it. The Northwests broke that promise. They have been breaking it for over a century. The lumberjack was killed during the original construction. In a way, Pacifica's ancestors covered up, and his ghost has been waiting every year for the family to keep the deal. They never have. The episode is, on its own, one of the most satisfying single hours of the show, but the wider lore reveal is also significant, because the series pulls another curtain back at the very end. The portrait of Nathaniel Northwest hanging in the town hall, the one in the hat and the noble pose, the one the entire town is taught to revere, is not actually Nathaniel Northwest. Nathaniel Northwest, the show implies, did not even exist as the noble founder he is portrayed as being. The Northwest family, the show argues, paid for that portrait, paid for that history, paid for the founding myth itself, and the actual origin of the town is murkier and more compromised than any of its inhabitants are allowed to know. Pacifica, when she learns this, has to decide whether she is going to be the kind of Northwest her parents want, or the kind of person she wants. And the show, to its credit, lets her choose the second. Around all of these larger plot mysteries, the show keeps quietly working out the smaller, more personal mysteries of its side characters, and one of the most carefully drawn of these is Seuss, the handyman at the Mystery Shack. Seuss goes by that nickname for as long as anyone in the show can remember, and his given name, by most fan accounts of the supplemental material, is some form of Jesus Ramirez. On the surface, he is one of the show's most endearingly simple figures. a soft, round, perpetually upbeat man in a brown work shirt who lives with his grandmother in a small house on the outskirts of town, who calls Stan his hero, who calls Dipper and Mabel his best friends in the world, and who treats every supernatural event in the town with the same cheerful equanimity he treats a broken vending machine. He is, in other words, the show's heart. He is also, the show eventually tells you, a person carrying a very specific quiet sadness, because Seuss's father walked out on him when he was a small child, on his birthday, and never came back. The writers drop this in casually in a relatively early episode and then keep coming back to it across both seasons, in small ways. His father sends postcards. His father promises to come home, sometimes for years at a time, and never quite does. His mother is absent in the show as a character. Seuss's grandmother, whom he calls Abuelita and adores, has been the parent figure in his life for as long as he can remember, and the way the show treats their relationship is one of the most genuinely tender threads in the entire series. Stan, in the same way, has been a kind of substitute father figure for Seuss at the shack for years, in the brusque, half-deniable way Stan does most of his caring, and one of the small triumphs of the show is the moment, in the second season, when Seuss confronts the reality that his actual father is not coming back, and that the men who actually showed up for him, the ones who were there, were the ones who mattered. Seuss's whole arc is in some sense a small mirror of the larger Pines family arc. Family is not always the people whose blood you share. Family is the people who actually show up. The show keeps returning to this idea, in different shapes, across both Seuss and the twins and Stan and Stanford, and by the time the finale comes around, the entire series has essentially become an argument about what family is for. It is many things at once, a comedy, a mystery, a cosmic horror, but at its core it is a long, careful meditation on chosen family. And Seuss's quiet story under the noise of the larger plot is one of the cleanest expressions of that argument. Wendy Corduroy, the teenage cashier, is the other carefully drawn side character whose story runs in parallel to the main mystery. Wendy is 15 years old, a redhead in a flannel shirt and a winter cap, the daughter of the town lumberjack, and she works at the shack mostly to get out of the house and out from under her father's specific style of overbearing paternal pride. Dipper, in the very first season, develops a quick and overwhelming crush on her, and a significant portion of the early episodes is shaped by him trying badly to impress her without telling her how he feels. The show, to its credit, does not turn this into a will they won't they plot. The age gap is the age gap. 3 years at that point in their lives is more than 3 years. And the show makes Wendy aware of Dipper's crush relatively early and lets her be kind about it without ever entertaining the idea of a romance. They become friends instead. They are, by the end of the show, real friends. The kind who go on adventures together. The kind who can sit on the roof of the shack at night and talk about whatever is on their minds. And the writing does something fairly graceful with the resolution of Dipper's feelings, treating his eventual letting go of the crush as a small piece of growing up rather than as a heartbreak. Wendy's own friend group, the teenagers who hang around the convenience store, are sketched in just enough that they each have a clear shape, and one of them, the dark-haired guitarist called Robbie Valentino, becomes a recurring antagonist of sorts for Dipper, a slightly older boy who is dating Wendy in the early episodes, and who, the show eventually reveals, has been using a kind of brainwashing tape to influence her affection. The episode in which Dipper figures this out is a small first-season highlight, and the resulting breakup between Wendy and Robbie is treated with a kind of low-key adolescent realism that the show does not always reach, but does at its best. Robbie himself, in keeping with the show's general gentleness towards its antagonists, is given his own moments of being a person rather than a punchline, especially in the second season episode that gives him a depressive arc and lets him work through it without being humiliated. The teenagers in the show are not the center of attention, but they are drawn with enough care that you understand the town has lives outside the shack, and that Wendy and her friends are doing their own version of the same growing up the twins are doing across the summer. Mabel's own romantic life across the show is also given more weight than a less careful series would have bothered with, and the running thread of it is the slowly built argument that growing up means accepting things that you do not want to accept. Mabel falls in love almost immediately and almost constantly. She falls in love with one of the gnomes in the very first episode, before discovering he is actually several gnomes in a coat, a piece of imagery the show enjoys so much that the gnomes come back as recurring background creatures for the rest of the run. She falls in love with a merman called Mermando, whom she meets in a hotel pool, and whose return to the ocean she has to accept with more grief than the situation entirely warrants. She falls in love with a boy named Gabe who runs a sock puppet show, in an arc that ends with her losing him because she has, more or less, lost track of her brother's safety in pursuit of him. She falls, complicatedly, for a boy who turns out to be a much older monster in disguise. She falls, equally complicatedly, for ordinary boys at parties. The show treats all of these with a kind of unironic affection. Mabel's enthusiasm for romance is never mocked. The writers do not punish her for being a young teenage girl with a wide-open heart. What they do over the 2 seasons is gently introduce her to the idea that wanting something with all your heart does not guarantee that you get to keep it, and that some of what she wants, in particular the wish that the summer would never end, is a wish that the universe is going to deny her no matter how loudly she asks. The show handles that idea with great care, and it pays off in the 2nd season finale in a way that genuinely hurts. There is another arc threaded through the show that does not always get talked about as much as it should, and that is the running plot of the time travelers. Early in the 1st season, Dipper and Mabel pick up an object from a stranger in a wheat field, and the object turns out to be a time travel device that has accidentally fallen out of his pocket. The stranger, a clumsy, panicked man in a green suit and a pair of large goggles, is called Blandon, and he is a time travel inspector from many centuries in the future. The time travel device, when activated, allows the user to jump backward and forward through time in roughly the way a child would imagine a time travel device working. And the show uses it in one early episode to play out a series of cheerful sketches in which the twins use the device for petty pleasures, undoing small embarrassments and stealing small treats, before discovering, gradually, that the timeline is a fragile thing and that small interventions do not stay small. The episode ends with Blendon recovering the device and warning them off any further use. And most first-time viewers file the whole story as a one-off comic detour. The writers are not done with it. Blendon returns in the 2nd season, much angrier, having been blamed by his employers for the damage the twins did with the device, and he comes back for revenge, in a long, exuberant set piece in which the twins are forced to compete with him in a kind of time-traveling gladiatorial contest. And along the way, the show introduces one of its more memorably odd cosmic figures, the giant infant called the Time Baby, who rules over the temporal authorities in the distant future and whose pronouncements echo with the kind of operatic absurdity the show loves. The Time Baby's role in the wider lore is, perhaps surprisingly, fairly important, because in the final episodes of the show he turns up in the back half of the 2nd season to try, very briefly, to intervene against Bill Cipher, and is dispatched by Bill almost immediately, in one of the most memorable jokes of the finale. The Time Baby's defeat tells you, more than almost any other beat in the show, how far above the level of normal cosmic interference Bill actually operates. The being who oversees time itself, in this universe, can be erased by Bill with a flick of his hand. The implication is unmistakable. Whatever Bill is, the rest of the cosmic hierarchy is not built to handle him. The next major piece of lore the show sets up, and the one that becomes essentially the structural map of the finale, is the symbol Stanford has carved into the floor of the basement. The great wheel of 10 interlocking symbols arranged around a central eye, which the fans came to call the Cipher Wheel or the Zodiac. Stanford built it during his research years, drawn at first from a vision Bill had given him before Stanford realized Bill was an enemy, and he believed at the time that the symbols on the wheel represented 10 specific people who, if assembled in the right order at the right time and joined by their hands, would form a kind of mystic seal that could imprison or banish Bill once Bill broke through into our reality. The show plays a long game with this symbol. You see it in the 1st season in the background, on doors, in journals, etched into stone in the deep parts of the woods. You see it sketched again in the 2nd season as Stanford's plans become more desperate. You see the 10 symbols themselves slowly attach themselves to the show's main cast, as the writers, with great care and over many episodes, give almost every major character their own symbol on the wheel. The pine tree on Dipper's hat, the shooting star on one of Mabel's sweaters, the question mark on Seuss's shirt, the bag of ice that has been associated with Wendy from the very 1st season, the pair of glasses associated with Stanford, The six-fingered hand of the journals, also tied to him. The stitched heart on Robbie's hoodie, which the show keeps quietly putting on screen across both seasons. The crescent moon on Grunkle Stan's fez, a piece of background design the show has been showing you in almost every frame Stan appears in. The llama on Pacifica's sweater, an image the show drops in a single shot in the Season 2 premiere, and that becomes a kind of fan-favorite Easter egg. The pentagram star associated with Gideon, a character who at this point in the show is supposed to be the cast's villain and who, when the symbol finally comes into play, has to be persuaded by the rest of the group to lay a hand on the wheel alongside the people he has spent 2 seasons trying to destroy. The very design of the wheel is the show telling you, quietly and well in advance, that the only way Bill is going to be beaten is if every faction in the town, including the most antagonistic and the most reluctant, finds a way to stand together. The show stages the gathering of the wheel in the finale, in one of the most genuinely tense sequences of the entire run, and then, in a piece of structural cleverness that probably split the fandom for the first few weeks after broadcast, the writers deny you the easy completion of the wheel and force the family to win the day a different way. The cipher wheel, in other words, is the foreshadowed solution that does not quite work, and the actual solution turns out to be something stranger and more emotionally devastating, although it still draws on the structure the wheel laid out. The wheel is the map. The wheel is not the destination. There is a piece of the world the show only barely gestures toward, but that turns out to be more important than any other single influence on Bill's character and on the cosmic hierarchy, and that is the figure called the Axelotl. The Axelotl is, by the show's own brief account, a kind of salamander-shaped cosmic being, an entity of enormous and benevolent power who exists somewhere above the level of beings like Bill, and whose name Bill himself appears to know and fear. The Axolotl is referenced in the show essentially once, in the very last seconds before Bill is defeated in the finale, when Bill, panicked and stripped of his power, mutters a desperate incantation calling on the Axolotl for some kind of intervention. The line is delivered as a strange, frightened plea, almost in a different voice. To anyone watching the show for the first time, it is genuinely baffling, and the writers provide no immediate context. It is one of the great unanswered mysteries of the original run, and the fans, predictably, made a meal of it. What the show does eventually clarify, in the much later canon supplemental book, is that the Axolotl is essentially what it appears to be, a higher-order cosmic entity whose presence sits above Bill's in the multiversal stack, and whose interventions have happened before, in other realities, and may yet happen in this one. The Book of Bill, the canon tie-in book published in 2024, gives a much more complete account of the Axolotl, including a sequence in which the Axolotl is implied to have been involved in the trap in which Bill is finally caught. Inside the show itself, however, the Axolotl is essentially a closing line, a one-beat suggestion that the universe is larger than even Bill can comprehend, and that there are forces in it that even he must appeal to in the last moments. It is one of the most carefully placed pieces of mystery box writing in the entire series, because it is just enough to tell you that there is more, and so little that you have to invent the more yourself, and the show is content to leave you doing that. The Axolotl, in the years since the show ended, has become one of the most discussed pieces of Gravity Falls lore, the subject of theories about reincarnation, about the Pines family's role in some larger cosmic plan, about whether Bill is going to come back in some altered form, and about whether the rest of the show's cast might themselves be playing roles in a story being written by an older and stranger author than any of them suspect. The show very carefully does not confirm or deny any of this. The rift in reality, the actual physical wound in space and time that the portal eventually creates, is something the show treats with great delicacy. After the portal closes in the middle of the second season, with Stanford safely home, the basement is not quite the same as it was before, and Stanford eventually shows Dipper a small, glowing, fist-sized object that he keeps inside a glass container, a kind of cracked geometric anomaly that he calls the rift. It is, in essence, a souvenir of the dimensional damage the portal did, a frozen piece of the wound itself that Stanford has been working to contain. The show then spends most of the back half of the second season setting up the eventual moment when this object will break, because the writers are fairly clearly telegraphing that everything depends on it staying contained. And so by the conventions of storytelling, the audience knows, even before the characters do, that it is going to fail. The episode in which it does fail is one of the most carefully constructed of the show's emotional ambushes. Dipper and Mabel are coming up on their 13th birthday. Dipper, having become Stanford's apprentice, is being asked to make a decision he is not quite ready to make. Whether to stay in Gravity Falls and continue his work with his great uncle, or to go home at the end of the summer with his sister, as they had originally planned. Mabel, who has spent the summer terrified of growing up, of changing, of losing the closeness she and her brother have always shared, is having one of the worst days of her life, and on top of it she has been told, briefly by Stanford, that Dipper might stay. She runs. She finds, in the woods, a strange figure who promises that she can have one more endless summer, that nothing has to change, that everything can stay the way it is. The figure, of course, is Bill. He is wearing a disguise. He convinces her to give him the rift. She does, in a moment that is essentially a child's bargain made in grief. The rift is broken. The damage is unleashed. The end of the world begins. What happens after the rift breaks is what the show calls Weirdmageddon, and it is, structurally, the longest sustained crisis in any animated show of its kind. A 3-part finale arc that essentially turns Gravity Falls into a different show for the last several episodes of its run. Bill enters the physical world. He arrives in a great triangular crack in the sky, accompanied by his Henchmaniacs, the gang of 2-dimensional creatures from his home dimension whose names and shapes the show has fun with, even as it lets them be genuinely menacing. The town is, almost instantly, transformed. Reality itself starts to behave according to Bill's logic, rather than ours. The sky becomes a swirling magenta. Animals fuse together into strange composite creatures. Buildings warp and stretch and regrow themselves at impossible angles. Furniture becomes sentient, then becomes hostile. Time becomes uncertain, with some areas of the town frozen in single moments and others looping or sliding. Bill's eye becomes the sun. The townspeople, the same townspeople whose memories had been edited for decades by the Society of the Blind Eye, are turned to stone by Bill in a series of vicious party tricks, then collected like trophies and stacked into a kind of decorative throne. The show is doing something brave here, because most children's adventure series, on reaching this point, would pull back. Gravity Falls does not pull back. The story stays in the apocalypse for the entire finale arc, and it makes you sit with the destruction in a way that very few of its peer shows would risk. The transformation is presented as both terrifying and, in a strange way, beautiful. The color palette of the finale, all magenta and gold and electric blue, is one of the most distinctive looks any animated finale has ever had. And the storyboarders pull a level of weird imagination out of the setting that the earlier seasons had only hinted at. Bill's new throne, the dome he creates around the center of town, the eye bats that patrol the sky, the prison bubble where the captured locals are kept, all of it is presented with the care of an artist who has been waiting for the moment to finally cut loose. The finale episodes look like nothing else the show ever did, and they look like nothing else most other Disney shows ever did either. For the last few hours of its run, Gravity Falls is essentially in a different genre. The rules of the Weirdmageddon world, the ones Bill imposes by his presence, are worth listing carefully because the show is consistent about them. Bill cannot leave the dome around the town. He is bound by some invisible boundary that prevents his influence from spreading further into our reality than the immediate area of the rift, and the show eventually tells you, in passing, that this is because a kind of cosmic equation, set up by the higher entities the axolotl belongs to, prevents Bill from crossing certain natural limits without help. The implication, without being quite stated, is that Bill's expansion beyond the dome would require either the destruction of the Cipher Wheel or some other large act of will on the part of his enemies, and Bill spends a fair amount of the finale trying to engineer exactly that. He cannot directly harm certain people, in particular Stanford, because Stanford has a metal plate in his skull that prevents Bill from entering his mind, an installation Stanford made for himself after his original betrayal, and that pays off, beautifully, in the finale. He cannot harm Mabel inside her bubble, although he can lock her inside it indefinitely, because the bubble is built on her own wish for a summer that never ends, and Bill has a sort of dimensional sportsman's respect for a deal made fairly. He cannot enter the cipher wheel ritual if all 10 symbols are linked. And, the show eventually reveals, he cannot enter Stanley's mind either, because the metal plate trick is one Stanley can also benefit from when he is in the right body. And this becomes the absolutely central piece of mechanics on which the finale's victory eventually turns. The rules of the Weirdmageddon world are not arbitrary. Each one of them, by the time the finale arrives, has been set up earlier in the show in some way, and each one of them pays off when it matters. The chaos here is not lazy chaos. It is bound chaos, and the binding is what makes the finale work. Mabel's prison bubble is one of the most carefully imagined sequences in the whole show, and it deserves its own pause, because it is the show's most direct dramatization of the central theme it has been worrying at all summer. Mabel, having broken under the strain of her brother's choice to stay in Gravity Falls and the impending end of the summer, is captured by Bill and placed inside a vast pink sphere, the surface of which is gauzy and elastic and impossible to escape from the outside, and the inside of which is a world built entirely out of Mabel's own happiest memories. Inside the bubble, everything is constantly summer. The sky is candy, the grass is jelly. There is a town built out of her favorite sweaters. There are friends who are always pleased to see her, made of straw and cardboard and not quite real. There are romantic interests who agree with everything she says. There is a version of Dipper who has decided to stay, who never grows up, who never moves away, who never changes. The bubble is, in its way, the most generous prison Bill could possibly have built. He has given Mabel everything she said she wanted. He has given her the summer that never ends. The show, with great care, lets her enjoy the bubble for a while. There is no obvious moral panic. There is no immediate snap into wisdom. The bubble is, on its own terms, lovely, and the show lets you feel that. And then, slowly, the writers let Mabel begin to feel the difference between a thing being lovely and a thing being real. The cardboard friends repeat themselves. The fake Dipper does not push back. The summer that never ends is, increasingly, a summer that never moves. When Dipper finally finds his way into the bubble, sent in by Stanford to bring her out, the confrontation between the two of them is, on rewatch, one of the most painful conversations the show ever wrote. Mabel does not want to leave. She does not want to grow up. She does not want to lose the closeness she has always had with her brother. She does not want the world she knows to disappear into a world she does not know. And Dipper, who has been turning over the same questions all summer in a slightly different shape, has to tell her, in the end, that he is not going to stay in Gravity Falls. He has decided to go home with her. They are going to grow up together. The summer is going to end. And the only way out of the bubble is to walk out of it together. The bubble breaks. The sequence is one of the quietly best pieces of writing in any Disney finale, and it is doing two things at once. It is the literal release of Mabel from a Bill-imposed trap. It is also the show's deepest expression of its argument about childhood. You cannot stay. You are never going to be allowed to stay. The summer is going to end. The only question is whether you walk out of it with the people you love beside you, or whether you cling to it alone until the world makes the decision for you. The actual defeat of Bill Cipher, the way it happens in the very last episode, is one of the most carefully prepared and emotionally heavy endings in any cartoon of the last 20 years, and it is worth walking through it step by step, because almost every piece of the show feeds into it. The plan, when the assembled family and their allies finally gather inside the destroyed shack to figure out how to stop Bill, comes from Stanford, the man who knows him best, the man who built the portal, the man who has been preparing for this moment for 30 years across multiple dimensions. The plan is the cipher wheel. All 10 symbols, all 10 people, joined in a circle, capable of channeling a kind of energy that will trap Bill and banish him from this dimension. The team have managed to gather most of the 10 by this point in the finale. Pacifica is there, Seuss is there, Wendy is there, Robbie is there, Dipper and Mabel are there, McGucket is there, lucid and brilliant for the first time in years. Stanford is there, Stan is there, Gideon, who has switched sides, is there, having decided in the moment that whatever grievance he has with the family is not as important as the cosmic horror trying to eat reality. The team form the circle. They join hands. The wheel begins to glow. They prepare to channel the energy that will end the apocalypse. And in the moment before it can fire, Stan and Stanford break the chain, because the two of them are still not speaking to each other, because their lifelong rivalry has flared up at exactly the wrong moment, and the wheel collapses. Bill arrives. The plan is in ruins. The team is captured. The world is going to end. And the show, in one of the bravest narrative choices it ever made, refuses to give you the easy victory the wheel had promised. The setup that the entire series had spent 2 seasons building does not actually pay off the way it was supposed to. The Cipher wheel does not save the world. The world is saved another way, and the other way is, in the end, the more emotionally honest one. The plan that does save the world is improvised by Stanford and Stanley together in the back of Bill's prison in the last moments before the world ends. Bill, having won, is in a celebratory mood. He is about to expand his Weirdmageddon dome to cover the rest of the planet. He needs only the formula Stanford has built into his own mind, the formula that closes the rift, which he intends to extract from Stanford by force. He puts a kind of psychic apparatus on Stanford's head. He prepares to enter Stanford's mind to take the formula. Stanford, sitting in the chair, looks at his brother across the room, and the two of them communicate, almost without speaking, in a way that only twins who grew up sharing a bunk bed can. The plan they improvise in that moment is essentially a small mirror of the trick Stanley has been pulling on the town for 30 years. The two of them are identical twins. They look almost exactly alike. They have, for most of their lives, been mistaken for each other. The metal plate that protects Stanford's mind from Bill is in Stanford's skull, but the protection it offers is, in this critical moment, less about the body Bill is trying to enter than about whose mind Bill believes he is entering. The trick is to swap clothes. Stanley, who has spent 30 years pretending to be Stanford for the outside world, can pretend to be Stanford for Bill. Stanford, who has the formula in his mind, can pretend to be Stanley. The two of them swap. Stan puts on his brother's coat. Stanford puts on his brother's fez. Bill, having no reason to look closer, enters the mind he believes to be Stanford's and finds himself inside the mind of Stanley Pines, the small-time grifter, the brawler, the human being whose mind is about to become the trap. The trap snaps shut. Bill is caught inside Stanley's mind with no way out. Stanford sets the memory-erasing helmet on Stanley's head. The helmet fires. Stanley's mind is erased, and Bill, the trickster god, the cosmic horror, the being who killed the time baby, is erased with it. The world is saved. The dome falls. The town comes back. The townspeople, frozen by Bill, return to flesh. The sky resumes its color. The apocalypse ends. And in the middle of it, sitting in the wreckage of his own home, the man whose mind has just been deleted to save the world sits, smiling vaguely, holding his brother's hand, with no idea who his brother is. The aftermath sequence, the slow recovery as the family tries to put Stanley's memory back together, using photographs and home movies and the journals and the scrapbook Mabel had been keeping all summer, is one of the most quietly beautiful sequences any animated show ever produced. The team takes turns sitting with him. They show him the pig. They show him the shack. They show him pictures of himself as a child with his brother on the beach. Slowly, in fragments, his memory comes back. He remembers the boat. He remembers the bedroom above the pawn shop. He remembers his brother. He remembers the fight. He remembers the 30 years. He remembers the kids. He remembers, in one of the most quietly heart-wrenching beats in the finale, that he loves Mabel because of the way she smiles at him. The show treats his recovery not as a magical reset, but as a process, slow and uncertain and dependent on the people around him. The same family he spent 2 seasons quietly trying to take care of has now, in the end, gathered around him to take care of him in return. The same kids he had been keeping at arm's length for an entire summer are now sitting on the floor of his living room patiently telling him who he is. The series is, in its closing sequence, almost embarrassingly tender. It does not turn away from the cost of what Stanley did. It does not pretend the cost was small. It simply argues, quietly, that the cost was worth it, and that the recovery is possible, and that the family is going to do it together. The show then gives you the very last scenes of the summer, and they are some of the most carefully shot small scenes in any finale. The bus station, the luggage, the twins in the early morning walking to the bus that will take them home to California, Wendy On the platform, giving Dipper her hat, the same trapper hat she has worn through the entire show. In a moment, the writers are careful not to oversell. Seuss, in a slightly oversized brown work shirt, being officially handed the Mystery Shack by Stan, who has decided, after 30 years of running it as a cover, to retire and pass the business to the person who has always loved it the most. Stan and Stanford, standing together on the porch, looking at the Stan-O war they had wanted to sail as boys, and discussing, almost shyly, the possibility that they might finally take that trip together. The twins, on the bus, watching the town recede, the pine trees thinning into farmland, the morning light going gray and gold over the road, the whole summer behind them, the whole summer over, their 13th birthday already passed, the childhood they had been worrying about losing all summer already, quietly, gone. The bus drives away, the credits roll, and the show ends. That is, broadly, the main spine of the show, but to talk about every mystery in Gravity Falls without talking about the ciphers would be to skip one of the most distinctive things about the series. Almost every episode of Gravity Falls ends with a brief stretch of credits during which an apparently random string of letters appears at the bottom of the screen. And almost every one of those strings, if you take the time to work it out, is actually an encoded message in one or another classical cipher. The earliest episodes use a simple substitution cipher called the Caesar cipher, in which each letter of the alphabet is shifted backward by a fixed number of places. The hint, embedded in the show itself, is buried in the very first seconds of the opening title sequence, where if you reverse the strange whispered phrase you hear in the background, you can make out the words 3 letters back, which is also the key to the cipher running through the first stretch of episodes. The middle of the first season switches to a different cipher, the Atbash, in which each letter of the alphabet is mapped to its mirror, so that the first letter becomes the last, the second becomes the second to last, and so on. The hint to switch to the Atbash is, in keeping with the show's general love of layered clues, hidden in another piece of the credit sequence. A little later in the first season, the show moves to what is known as a 1Z26, a numerical substitution cipher in which each letter is given its position in the alphabet, and the messages become strings of numbers separated by hyphens that work out to short phrases. By the time you reach the second season, the writers have graduated to the Vigenary cipher, a much more sophisticated polyalphabetic substitution that requires not just an algorithm but a specific keyword to decode. And the keywords for the Season 2 messages are themselves clues hidden inside the episodes, leading you to discover, for example, that one episode's cipher key is the name of a character who only appears briefly, or a phrase a character muttered as a throwaway line. The deepest of these layered ciphers is in the Season 2 finale, where the cipher running across multiple credit sequences encodes a series of pieces of dialogue from earlier moments in the show, knitting the whole experience together into a kind of secret final speech. The show was designed from a very early stage to reward exactly the kind of obsessive rewatching that the journals reward inside the story. The structure outside the screen mirrors the structure inside it. You are, in a sense, expected to be Dipper, working through the journal of the show itself. The hidden messages decoded by the fan community from these ciphers, across the run of the show, mostly amount to small thematic asides, jokes, foreshadowings of upcoming plot points, occasional warnings, occasional names. Some of them spell out lines of poetry. Some of them spell out instructions to look more carefully at the episode you have just watched. Some of them spell out the names of characters who have not yet appeared but who will appear in later episodes. Some of them, in the second season, begin to spell out fragments of the larger Bill Cipher prophecy and the structure of the cipher wheel itself. The writers are fairly careful never to require you to decode the ciphers in order to understand the basic plot, which is the right design decision for a show aimed at children. The plot is fully comprehensible on the surface. The ciphers are an additional, optional layer for the fans who want to spend a Friday night decoding a string of letters. But the additional layer is real. The additional layer pays off. It rewards the work. And the show was, by the end, fully aware that the fans were doing this work. And the writers responded by deepening the puzzles in the second season rather than simplifying them. By the end of the second season, the ciphers had become a genuine alternate reading of the show, parallel to the main plot, occasionally revealing material that was nowhere else available on the screen. The most famous example, almost certainly, is a particular cipher near the end of the show that, when decoded, reveals a kind of monologue from Bill Cipher himself addressed directly to the audience, in a tone that essentially acknowledges that he knows we are out here. The fourth wall of Gravity Falls is, by the end, paper thin, and Bill knows it. The show's relationship with its audience reached, in 2016, into the real world. Alex Hirsch, the creator, launched a real-world treasure hunt called the Cipher Hunt, in which a series of clues hidden across the internet led fans, across the course of a few weeks that summer, to a physical statue of Bill Cipher buried in a remote field in the state of Oregon, in a forested area not far from the small coastal town of Reedsport. The hunt was, in a way, exactly the kind of game the show had been training its audience to play across 2 seasons. Fans worked in shifts, on online forums, decoding messages in different languages, exchanging photographs of clues, sending volunteers across the country and across the world to physical locations to find further clues. The statue was eventually found by a group of fans in early August in the forest with a small message etched onto it. The whole event lasted for about 2 weeks and was, by most accounts, one of the most successful and emotionally charged interactions between a creator and an audience in the history of animated television. The Cipher Hunt was, more than anything else, the show's outside-the-screen confirmation of what the show inside the screen had been saying all along. The fans were not passive watchers. The fans were part of the world. The fans were Dipper, in their own way, working through the journals. The fans were the secret society of researchers Stanford had always wanted to find. The show, by its final months, had become, for a brief moment, a real cooperative mystery operating across the entire fandom, and the experience left a kind of permanent mark on the people who participated in it. You can still find the photographs of the statue on the internet, in odd corners, looking small and weathered in the soil. It is one of the strangest pieces of evidence that the show was, by the end, doing something much larger than a children's adventure. There are a great many smaller mysteries the show plants and answers along the way that do not fit cleanly into the main lore, but that are part of the texture of the show's mystery layer. And the best of them deserve mention here, even if the writers treat them as side dishes rather than main courses. There is, for one, the mystery of the haunted convenience store, where the ghost of an old shopkeeper has been keeping a kind of vigil over his lost business for years, and the small ghost story the show builds around him is one of the most genuinely creepy single episodes in the first season. There is the mystery of the wax figures, which turn out to be sentient at night, and which begin a small murder mystery aimed at Stan. There is the mystery of the haunted carpet, which gives the show an excuse to do an episode about body swapping. There is the mystery of the lake monster, which the show handles with a kind of small-town affection. There is the mystery of the gnomes, which keeps coming back across both seasons, in part because the gnomes themselves are essentially a recurring background joke. There is the mystery of the haunted video game, which gives Dipper and Seuss one of their most charming buddy episodes. There is the mystery of the giant pterodactyl in the abandoned mines, which the journals quietly catalog and the show eventually drops in for a single set piece. There is the buried mystery of Old Man McGucket's youthful career as an engineer, which gradually emerges across multiple episodes. There is the mystery of the manitors, which becomes the spine of a small Dipper coming-of-age story. There is the mystery of the shapeshifter trapped in a bunker beneath the woods, in one of the most genuinely scary single episodes of the second season, in which the creature, in its dying breath, takes the shape of something it tells Dipper will be the thing he fears most, and the show, with great care, lets the audience imagine for themselves what shape that turned out to be. None of these stories are essential to the main spine of the lore, but together they make up the dense atmospheric texture of the town that makes Gravity Falls feel, on rewatch, less like a story and more like a place. There is another whole set of mysteries the show plants around the federal government's awareness of Gravity Falls, and they are worth talking about because they widen the scope of the show beyond the immediate cast. Across the first season and into the second, 2 stiff-necked agents in dark suits begin appearing in town, sent from somewhere in the federal government, on the trail of strange phenomena and persistent reports of unidentified activity in the area. They are introduced essentially as comic foils, 2 earnest men who keep almost catching the supernatural and keep almost being satisfied with rational explanations the kids accidentally provide for them. The show plays them, for most of their appearances, as a kind of running joke about how the rational world keeps almost colliding with the irrational world in Gravity Falls, and keeps just managing to look the other way. There is, however, a real question buried in their arc, which is the question of how a town this strange has managed to escape proper investigation for as long as it has. The writers imply, although they never quite say, that someone in the government does know that there is at least one file in some gray office somewhere flagging Gravity Falls as anomalous, and that the agents have been sent up to confirm and probably to contain whatever is happening. The Society of the Blind Eye, with its memory erasure operation, is one of the reasons the town has stayed off the official radar. The locals' deliberate cultivation of strange weather as a tourist attraction, with the Mystery Shack itself essentially marketing the supernatural as a gimmick, is another. The town's geographic isolation is a third. The combined effect is that the federal government, by the time the show is happening, has filed Gravity Falls under unlikely but possible, and is sending two perpetually frustrated agents up once or twice a year to file a report that always concludes nothing of note. When Weirdmageddon happens, the government's response is essentially to declare the area off limits and seal the perimeter, in a quietly unsettling sequence that the show holds for just a few seconds. The implication is that whatever the government did or did not know about Gravity Falls before, the moment the apocalypse arrives, they simply walk away and let it happen. The town is on its own. The town has always been on its own. And the small handful of people inside it are going to have to save it themselves. The mystery of Stanford's missing finger is one of the small physical mysteries the show plants, and then does not entirely answer inside the original run. Stanford has, the show notes carefully, 12 fingers, 6 on each hand, the result of the polydactyl gene that ran in his family. He does, by the time he returns from the portal, also have a scar across one of his eyes, and a slightly clouded look in that eye, and a slight stiffness in some of his movements. The show is fairly clear that he has been through a great deal during his 30 years in the multiverse, and that some of the damage is permanent. The supplemental materials, in particular the canon tie in book, fill in more of what happened to him during those years, including a series of stories about the alliances he formed in different dimensions, the dimensional resistance group he briefly joined, the battles he fought against agents of Bill in other realities, and the long, slow journey he made through dozens of universes before finally making it back to the one he had started in. Inside the show, however, the damage is presented as the kind of damage you do not press someone about. He does not talk about most of it. The few stories he tells the kids about his time away are clipped and shadowed, half wonder and half horror, and the show resists the temptation to give him a heroic monologue about his exile. He is just a man who left, and was changed, and came back, and the people who love him have to learn to love the man who came back, who is not the man who left. The writing is wise about this in a way many of its peers were not. He does not, for example, neatly forgive Stanley. He does not neatly bond with Dipper. He does not neatly slot back into the family. He has to earn his way back into them, slowly across the back half of the second season, and the show makes you watch the slow earning. And the slow earning is one of the most rewarding stretches of writing in the show. Stanley's history, before the show begins, is filled in across the same flashback episode in the second season that gives you Stanford's history, and a few additional episodes scatter further pieces of it. After being thrown out of his father's house in their last year of high school, Stanley spent the next 20 years as a small-time con man, drifting across the country, running short-term scams, getting into and out of brushes with the law, accumulating restraining orders in different countries by his own count, and living, mostly, out of the back of a car. He had relationships, none of them lasting. He had business ventures, none of them successful. He had at one point a wife, briefly, and the show drops this in casually in a single line without elaborating, which is the kind of thing the show does that makes you want to rewatch every episode looking for anything you might have missed. He spent the entire time wanting, on some level, to call his brother and not knowing how to. He was, the show implies, fairly close to giving up on the whole project of his life by the time the postcard from his brother arrived asking for help. The postcard was, in a way, the thing that saved him, even though it also became the cause of the next 30 years of his loneliness. The writers are very careful about Stanley. They do not make him noble. They do not pretend his life had been admirable. They do not pretend he did not deserve some of what happened to him. They simply argue, quietly, that what he did when his brother called for him, and what he did for the 30 years after, redeem him. The man you meet at the start of the show is not a noble man. He is a stubborn, sentimental, deeply lonely small-time crook who has been spending all of his stubbornness, sentimentality, and small-time skill on the singular project of getting his brother back. That, the show argues, is enough. A smaller and gentler mystery the show plants and answers is the mystery of Dipper's actual name. Dipper is, the show makes clear, a nickname, given to him because of the Big Dipper-shaped birthmark on his forehead, which he hides under the brim of his trapper hat throughout the show. His real name is not revealed in the show itself for a long time, and the writers treat this as a running joke, with Dipper repeatedly refusing to say his real name out loud whenever a character asks him. The show's creator eventually confirmed, in a supplemental release in the same year the show ended, that his real name is Mason Pines, a piece of information that fans had been speculating about for years and that, in the canon, has since been folded into the character. Mabel's real name, by contrast, is simply Mabel, and it has always been Mabel, and she has always been delighted by it. The contrast between the twin who hides his name and the twin who broadcasts hers is, on rewatch, one of the small, consistent character beats the show keeps quietly playing, in scene after scene, all the way through the run. It is not a beat the writers emphasize, it is just there. Dipper, the cautious one, is hiding. Mabel, the open one, is not. And the show, in the small ways it accumulates, builds you a picture of two twins who are temperamentally different in a way that has always been there. A great deal of the show's quieter texture comes from the way it folds in animal and creature subplots that turn out to matter more than they look like they should. Waddles, the pig Mabel adopts in the first season after winning him at the county fair, is technically a working farm pig who has been raised on a small holding outside the town, and who is, by show convention, simply Mabel's pet. But the writers keep elevating him quietly across both seasons until he is, by the finale, essentially a member of the family with his own arc and his own scenes. There is an episode in which Waddles is briefly given the ability to speak by way of an accidental experiment with one of the journal's formulas and his single speech, in which he tells Mabel that he loves her and that he has had a wonderful life, is one of the most strangely affecting moments in the entire show, played mostly for comedy and partly for something much more tender. There is the running joke of Stan's grumpy refusal to admit that he likes Waddles, which the show keeps undercutting by quietly showing Stan feeding him bacon at the dinner table when he thinks no one is looking. There is the moment, late in the show, when Waddles is briefly taken from Mabel by an aggrieved farmer in an episode the writers treat with surprising seriousness. The series, in its smallest moments, keeps reminding you that the characters it has been investing in include the ones with hooves. The same is true of Seuss's beloved pet handheld, the same handheld he carries through the show, and the same is true of the deer Stanford keeps in the woods. The same is true of the various small dogs and cats and gnomes that drift through the background. The same is true of the bottomless pit. The same is true of the talking head in the jar. The show treats its odd inhabitants as inhabitants, not a set dressing, and the cumulative effect is a world that feels populated rather than designed. The bunker in the woods is one of the larger pieces of the supernatural infrastructure the show buries and never fully explains. And it deserves its own small treatment because it is one of the most strikingly designed locations in the entire series. Stanford, during his research years, built a hidden bunker into the side of a hill in the forest, accessible only through a hatch concealed under a tree, and inside the bunker is a long laboratory, a series of armories, a set of containment cells, and a deep chamber at the very back where Stanford kept one of his most dangerous prisoners, the shape-shifting creature he had captured in his early monster hunting years. The bunker is, in the original show, the setting for one of the most genuinely scary single episodes the series ever produced. Dipper, Wendy, Mabel, and Seuss find their way into it on the trail of one of the journal's clues. And over the course of the episode, they discover that the shapeshifter Stanford had imprisoned in the back is still alive, still hungry, and still very angry. The episode is essentially a small horror movie inside the larger show, with the shapeshifter eventually freed and pursuing the team through the dark corridors of the bunker, taking the form of each of their loved ones in turn, taunting them, threatening them, and eventually being frozen in a containment cell by Dipper at the cost of a final, ambiguous threat. The shapeshifter's last act is to transform into the shape of a thing it tells Dipper is what he most fears, and the show holds the shape on screen for just long enough that you can see it, Fans have spent years debating exactly what the shape signifies, and the show itself never returns to it in the rest of the run, which is part of why the bunker episode remains, in many viewers' memories, one of the strangest single beats in the entire series. It is essentially a Pandora's box the show opens, and then never quite reseals. The series wants you to be left with the image. It wants you to wonder about it. It is, in its small ways, content to leave some questions open. One of the most quietly satisfying threads in the second half of the show is the slow rapprochement between Stan and Stanford, the brothers who have not spoken for 30 years, and who are now sharing a house and a basement and a complicated set of children for the rest of the summer. The writing is honest about how slowly that rapprochement happens. Stanford resents Stanley for the way the portal accident happened, even though he eventually comes to understand that Stanley spent 30 years trying to bring him back. Stanley resents Stanford for the way Stanford has re-entered the family and taken up a kind of paternal authority Stanley feels he himself has earned. The two of them argue about who runs the shack. They argue about Dipper. They argue about the journals. They argue, in one of the funniest scenes the show ever wrote, about whose turn it is to make breakfast. The writers treat the argument between them not as a small obstacle to be cleared by the finale, but as the actual texture of their relationship. The kind of grudge that two brothers can carry for a lifetime, and that does not actually go away just because the world has briefly ended. The show, to its credit, does not magically resolve their fight. The cipher wheel collapses, in the finale, precisely because their fight is still active. The plan that does save the world is a plan that requires them to trust each other in spite of the fight, not because it has been resolved. And the very last moments of the show, with the two of them standing on the porch, looking at the old boat they had wanted to sail as boys, do not so much resolve the fight as set it aside. They have decided to spend whatever years they have left as something a little more like brothers than they have been allowed to be for most of their adult lives. The show is not pretending that the fight is over. The show is suggesting, very gently, that the fight can be set aside, and that the setting aside, at the right time, is itself a kind of love. The town's culture, the small festivals and weirdness celebrations the locals have built around their valley's strangeness, is one of the most thoroughly worked out background features of the show and is worth a small detour for its own sake. There is the annual Pioneer Day, where the townspeople dress up in old-fashioned clothes and reenact what they believe to be the founding story of the town, which, given what the show has revealed about the Northwest family's role in faking that founding story, has a kind of double meaning the locals do not realize. There is the Summerween Festival, an off-season Halloween celebration unique to Gravity Falls, in which the locals invent costumes and host parties and tell ghost stories in the middle of July, and which gives the show an excuse to do a holiday special in the wrong season. There is the Woodpecker Festival, the Lumberjack Contest, the weekly bingo at the diner, the annual party at the Northwest Manor. The town is, on its surface, a normal small town with too many festivals and not quite enough to do. The writers keep showing you these festivals in the background of episodes, and the cumulative effect is that you start to feel as if you know the rhythm of the town's year, that you could, if you had to, put together a kind of calendar for the place. That is a remarkable thing for a show to achieve in only 40 episodes, and it speaks to how carefully the writing room invested in the town as a place rather than as a backdrop. Bill Cipher's Henchmaniacs, the gang of two-dimensional creatures who arrive with him at the beginning of Weirdmageddon and who serve as his lieutenants during the apocalypse, are themselves a small set of mysteries within the larger plot. There is the 8-ball figure with the face on the cue ball, who serves as one of Bill's most loyal enforcers. There is the keyhole-shaped creature, the small pyramid of teeth, the crypto-shaped figure, and a handful of other carnival oddities that patrol the streets of Weirdmageddon, turning the townspeople to stone for sport. The show is, perhaps, a little sparing in the amount of personal backstory it gives each of them, mostly content to let them be a kind of carnival of menace. But they each have small, consistent personalities that make them more than generic background goons. The 8-ball is a kind of weary middle manager. The teeth pyramid is a giggling sadist. The Cryptos figure is, the show implies, Bill's particular favorite, an old friend from his home dimension, a kind of confidante. The whole group reads as a band of refugees from the same destroyed home, a kind of grim parody of a friend group, all bound together by their shared loyalty to the smallest and most charismatic of them. The Book of Bill, the supplemental canon book, gives many of them more detailed backstories, including a chilling account of where Bill found each of them. But inside the show itself, they are essentially a moving threat, a color, a texture of the apocalypse. They are dispatched one by one in the finale, by the assembled cast and by the townspeople once the dome falls, and the show, which is generally careful about giving even its villains some kind of dignity, allows most of them to go out fighting rather than fleeing. The Cryptos figure in particular has a small, dignified end. The 8-ball gets a one-liner. The Henchmaniacs are, in the end, a flourish on Bill's apocalypse. The supporting cast he brought with him from another dimension, and their dispatch is part of the show's gradual reassertion of the rules of our world over the rules of his. The dreamscape, where Bill operates most freely, is treated by the show as a kind of parallel territory that exists alongside the physical world, accessible only through specific portals, dreams, certain unusual substances, and the application of specific symbols. Stanford visits the dreamscape, on screen in a single episode in the second season, and the dreamscape is rendered as a vast, dark, glowing landscape filled with floating shapes and impossible architecture, with Bill as its essential ruler. The show implies, although it never quite states, that all human dreams take place in a small region of the dreamscape, that the dreamscape contains the collective unconscious of the species in the same way the multiverse contains the collective physical reality of all dimensions, and that Bill, by inhabiting the dreamscape, has access to a kind of permanent low-level presence in every human mind. The metal plate Stanford has installed in his own skull, which prevents Bill from entering his mind during sleep, is therefore the only consistent defense the show offers against Bill's presence in the dreamscape. Anyone who is dreaming, anywhere, is potentially within his reach if Bill chooses to come looking. The show uses this idea sparingly, but the implications of it are some of the most interesting in the entire series. The dreamscape, in the world of Gravity Falls, is a place. The place is haunted by Bill. The only way to live in any kind of safety from him is to either install protection in your own head, as Stanford did, or to be lucky enough to never become interesting enough to him to be worth visiting. Most people, the show implies, never are. The Pines family is. The Pines family is interesting to Bill in a way that almost no one else in the show is, and the show is fairly clear, by the end, that this is essentially the curse the family has been carrying since Stanford first opened his journals and let Bill in. The Book of Bill, which was published in 2024 as a canon tie in book written by Alex Hirsch in the voice of Bill Cipher himself, has substantially deepened the lore of the show in the years since it ended, and any honest summary of the mysteries of Gravity Falls now has to fold it in, while being careful to flag exactly which pieces of information come from inside the original show, and which come from the supplemental book. The Book of Bill provides, among other things, a much fuller account of Bill's origin in his home dimension. According to the book, Bill was originally a being in the second dimension, a flat world of shapes, where he was responsible in some way for the destruction of his entire reality, including the deaths of his family. The book implies, although it does its best to keep the tone Bill himself would want, a level of grief and guilt behind Bill's surface charm that the show itself only gestured at. It provides a much fuller account of the Axelotl as a higher-order being, including a poem the Axelotl is said to recite over Bill, in which the Axelotl effectively gives Bill the conditions under which he might one day return. The book also confirms many of the long-held fan theories about the structure of the multiverse, the existence of other dimensions visited by Stanford during his exile, the existence of agents of Bill operating in other realities, and the existence of certain other anomalies in our own world that the show only briefly hinted at. The book is presented, in the voice of Bill, as an artifact passed down from his prison, a kind of message in a bottle written by him from inside Stanley's mind. And the framing is sufficiently clever that you have to keep reminding yourself that he is an unreliable narrator, and that the book is, at its core, a piece of canon written by a creator using a character as a mouthpiece. The book, in other words, is more lore than the show itself, but it is also stylist lore, and a careful viewer is wise to treat the show as the primary canon and the book as the elaboration. The mysteries of Gravity Falls do not need the book to be solved, but the book does sharpen some of the edges, and it has, in particular, given fans a much clearer sense of how Bill ended up in our dimension in the first place, and what his original sin in his home dimension may have been. The fate of Bill himself, after the finale, is the kind of question the show is content to leave hovering, although the supplemental material gives a slightly more definite answer than the original show ever did. In the show, Bill is erased along with Stanley's mind, and the implication is that he is gone, that the trick worked, that the cosmic horror who killed the Time Baby has been defeated for good by a small time grifter's willingness to give up his own mind. The very last seconds of Bill on screen, in which he turns to stone and crumbles into the wind, are presented with enough finality that most first-time viewers leave the show assuming he is dead. The cipher embedded in the credits of the finale, however, decoded by the fan community in the days after broadcast, contains a line that is essentially Bill telling the audience that he is not entirely gone, that there are conditions under which he might return, and the line is, depending on your reading, either a final joke from the creator or a real promise of future story material. The Book of Bill, when it eventually arrives, is essentially the answer to that question, and it includes material that implies, without quite confirming, that Bill is conscious, in some reduced state, inside a kind of cosmic prison, and that he is, in the way of all good villains, hoping. Whether or not that hope is ever paid off in further screen material is, as of the writing of this script, still unknown. One of the most delightful mysteries the show sets up and then immediately answers comes early in the first season. In the episode where Dipper, trying to be in two places at once, uses a strange photocopier in Stan's office to produce a duplicate of himself, and the duplicate then produces another duplicate, and the duplicates begin to multiply. And by the end of the episode, there are over a dozen Dippers running around the Mystery Shack, each with slightly different priorities and slightly different tempers, and the whole episode becomes a small comic study of what it actually means to be a single coherent person rather than a chorus of conflicting impulses. The episode is on its surface a one-off comedy, with a satisfying ending in which most of the duplicates dissolve in the rain because the original copies were paper, but the joke the show is playing has a longer tail than first-time viewers usually catch. The duplicates each represent a different facet of Dipper: the one who is concerned about other people, the one who is purely competitive, the one who is angry, the one who is afraid, the one who is in love with Wendy. The fact that these facets can be physically separated and then have to fight among themselves is at heart a quietly clever piece of writing about adolescence, and the show keeps returning, in different shapes, to the question of how a young person assembles a single self out of the chorus of selves that age 12 and 13 produce inside them. Mabel, in her own way, has the same struggle later in the show. Stan, in his own way, had the same struggle when he became his brother. The whole show, you start to realize on rewatch, is interested in how identity is built, how it is maintained, and what it costs to keep it together. The Dipper Clones episode is, in its way, the first time the show makes that argument in plain sight. The episode where Bill first possesses Dipper, in the second season, is another moment the show plants and pays off in a way that is more important than it looks. The setup is small. Mabel is trying to put on a sock puppet show in pursuit of a boy she is briefly in love with, and Dipper, busy with his journals, agrees to help her too half-heartedly and then bails when something more interesting comes up. Frustrated, Dipper makes a deal with Bill in a dream, agreeing to give Bill his body for a short time in exchange for Bill's help in solving the cipher in Journal 3. Bill takes the body. Dipper, ejected into the dreamscape, watches in horror as Bill, wearing him, runs amok across the Mystery Shack, sabotaging Mabel's puppet show, breaking into the deeper levels of the shack, hunting for the journals, beating up Dipper's body in a mirror, hurting Dipper's hand in a slamming window, eating handfuls of pages out of Journal 3. The episode is, frankly, more upsetting than most Disney children's shows ever get, and the writers pull off the difficult trick of keeping Bill and Dipper's body funny enough that you can stand to watch it while also making sure you understand exactly what is happening. Mabel, by the end of the episode, has to choose between accepting the boy she has been chasing and saving her brother. And the show, in a piece of writing that is genuinely lovely, makes her choose her brother. The boy goes home. The puppet show ends in chaos. Bill is forced out of Dipper's body. Dipper returns to himself, bruised and weak, and very glad to be back in his own skin. The episode is, in retrospect, the show's first proper introduction to what a Bill possession actually looks and feels like. And it sets up the wider stakes of the finale, in which a different and more permanent kind of possession is going to be the cost of victory. The sock opera episode, as it is generally known, is therefore one of the small load-bearing episodes of the second season. An episode that on its surface is a sister-sibling comedy about a puppet show, and on its underside is one of the most important pieces of foreshadowing in the entire series. The show's running mystery about the founders of the town, the question of who actually built Gravity Falls and why, is one of the smaller threads the show plants and only partially answers across both seasons. The Northwest family, as we have seen, claim the founding for themselves, but the show has revealed that their claim is essentially fraudulent, that the historical figure they pretend to have descended from did not particularly exist in the form they describe, and that the real founders of the town are a more complicated and less heroic set of people whose names the show leaves mostly off the page. What the writers do suggest in various pieces is that the town was founded by a small group of explorers in the early 1800s, that they arrived in the valley by accident, that they found the place strange from the first hour they walked into it, and that they decided to settle there anyway, partly for reasons of mineral wealth, and partly for reasons the journals describe as a kind of dimensional pull, the same softness in reality that has been drawing strange phenomena to the valley ever since. The Northwest family, the show implies, were not the leaders of the founding expedition. They were the wealthiest survivors of it. They paid, over the following century, to have their version of the founding put into the history books and the murals and the school textbooks of the town, and they have spent generations enforcing it. The real names of the founders are mentioned only briefly in the show, in a sequence in the second season where Pacifica and Dipper find an old document hidden behind the portrait of Nathaniel Northwest in the town hall, and the names on the document are not, mostly, the names you might expect. The series is content to leave the question of the real founders mostly unanswered, partly because the answer would not particularly serve the larger plot, and partly because the act of leaving it unanswered is itself part of the show's argument about historical memory, that the official story of a town is almost always cleaner and more flattering than the actual story of the people who built it. A small and easily missed piece of lore the show plants is the role of the local lawman, the sheriff and his deputy, who appear in the background of many episodes and who are essentially two friendly bumblers who treat the strangeness of the town as something between a job hazard and a kind of weekly hobby. The writers are careful with them. They are presented as a comedy duo, but the show also makes it clear that they are deeply embedded in the town's small social network, that they know almost everyone by name, that they have small private lives outside of their jobs, and that their willingness to look the other way when supernatural events happen is part of why the town has been able to keep its secrets for as long as it has. The show implies, although it never quite states, that they have been having their own memories edited by the Society of the Blind Eye for years, that they cannot remember most of the supernatural events they have personally witnessed, and that they are part of the same general pattern of forgetting that the town has been built on. Their relationship with each other is also one of the show's quieter background details, with the writing suggesting, in small ways across both seasons, that the two of them are essentially each other's closest companion in the town, and that they have built a life together inside the loose, informal bonds of the town's local life. The show does not press the point. It is content to let the small intimacy of their friendship be visible without underlining it. It is, on rewatch, one of the gentler pieces of writing in the series. The episode in the second season in which Dipper and Stanford finally get to bond over their shared love of a tabletop role-playing game called Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons is a small standalone piece of writing that nevertheless ties into the wider lore in a couple of significant ways. The game itself, which is a transparent, affectionate parody of the kind of tabletop fantasy role-playing game that millions of teenagers grew up on, is the kind of intellectual pastime that Stanford has loved his entire life, and that has been one of the small, consistent pleasures of his 30 years in the multiverse. Dipper, who has of course loved the same game his entire life, finds in Stanford the kind of equal opponent he has never had before, and the two of them sit down to play, with Mabel and Stan, who do not love the game, watching from the side with increasing impatience. Stanford produces, midway through the episode, a real artifact from his journals, a small many-sided die that he describes as an infinity-sided die, a piece of supernatural equipment that, when rolled, produces an outcome of literally any possible result, regardless of probability. He warns the group not to actually roll it. The roll, when it eventually happens by accident, summons a small magical creature called Probabulator who comes out of the die and into the room and forces the four of them to play a kind of physically embodied version of the game in order to send him back. The episode is, in part, a piece of comic fan service for tabletop players, and in part a small character study of Stan and Mabel, who do not love the game and who have to work out, by the end of the episode, how to play it well enough to save the day. The wider lore beat is the infinity-sided die itself, which the show treats as another piece of evidence that the journals contain real and dangerous artifacts, and that Stanford has been collecting and cataloging such artifacts for years, and that there are many more of them in the bunker and the basement and the shack than the audience has so far been shown. The die, in particular, is a piece of equipment whose existence implies a kind of physics underneath our physics, in which probability itself is a malleable thing. The show is content to leave the implication hanging. The episode in which Mabel and Dipper meet the version of themselves that they will eventually become, in a sense, is the Season 2 episode called Dipper and Mabel versus the Future, and it is one of the most emotionally pivotal episodes of the entire show. The episode is set on the day before the twins' 13th birthday. The summer is almost over. Mabel, having spent the summer cheerfully ignoring the fact that the summer is going to end, is forced in the course of the episode to confront the realization that the summer is essentially over already, that her brother is being offered an apprenticeship by Stanford that would keep him in Gravity Falls and away from her, that the changes she has been fearing are not theoretical changes happening at some unspecified future point, but actual changes happening today. The episode is structured around a sequence of small disappointments that gradually corner her. She tries to plan a party. The party falls apart. She tries to find Dipper to tell him how she feels. He is in the basement with Stanford. She walks the streets of the town, in tears, looking for some way to undo the thing that is happening, and the show, with great care, lets her walk for a long time in the rain. The figure who eventually finds her in the woods, in the closing minutes of the episode, is, as we have already discussed, Bill in disguise, and the bargain she makes with him for the rift is the moment the show pivots into its final apocalypse arc. The episode is, in retrospect, one of the most beautifully constructed character studies in the show, and the writing of Mabel in it is some of the most generous writing the show ever did. She is not stupid for falling for Bill's offer. She is heartbroken. The show is asking you, in essence, what you would have done at the age of 12 if a friendly stranger had appeared and offered you a way out of every fear you had ever had about growing up. Most 12-year-olds, the show suggests, would have at least considered the offer. The writing makes the choice she does not look weak so much as inevitable, and the way the show invites you to grieve with her rather than to blame her is one of the reasons the finale lands as hard as it does. The actual production history of Gravity Falls is worth a brief detour, because the show's ending is one of the more unusual creative decisions in modern animated television. Alex Hirsch, the creator, made the decision relatively early in the show's second season to end the series after that season, even though the show was a hit, and even though the network would have happily commissioned more. His stated reasoning, in interviews at the time and since, was essentially that he had a specific story he wanted to tell, that the story had a natural endpoint, that prolonging the show beyond that endpoint would mean dragging out the twins' summer indefinitely and breaking the central conceit that the summer is supposed to end, and that he would rather end the show on his own terms than let it become the kind of indefinitely renewed cartoon that gradually loses its meaning. The decision was, by all accounts, somewhat controversial at the network. The show was popular, the merchandise was selling, the fan community was at its peak. The cancellation, as it functionally was self-imposed, and it left the writers with the rare luxury of being able to plan their own ending in detail, with a full second season's worth of episodes dedicated to setting up and paying off the finale arc, without the kind of last-minute renewal uncertainty that has hampered so many similar shows. The series ended in early 2016 on the broadcast of the third part of the Weirdmageddon arc, and it left the fan community with the most satisfying ending any animated mystery show had produced in years. Hirsch has continued to work on Gravity Falls-related projects since then, including the supplemental book and various tie-in materials, but he has been fairly clear in interviews that he considers the original show's ending to be the actual ending of the story, and that any future material he produces in the world is a continuation of an essentially completed arc rather than a revival of an ongoing one. The discipline of that decision is, in retrospect, one of the reasons the show is remembered the way it is. Most shows of its kind are remembered fondly with caveats. Gravity Falls is remembered, almost unanimously, as a show that ended at exactly the moment it should have ended, with exactly the ending it should have had, and that is a rare thing in any medium. The wider influence of Gravity Falls on the years of animation that followed it is, by now, fairly well documented. The mystery box structure of the show, in which a children's adventure is loaded with hidden ciphers and layered mythologies and slow-burn character arcs, has been imitated by almost every American children's animated show that has come out since, with varying degrees of success. The willingness of the writers to take their young protagonists' inner lives seriously, to give them real emotional arcs and real losses and real fears, has reshaped what is possible in the genre. The show's commitment to a definite ending, rather than an indefinitely extended run, has been picked up by a number of subsequent show creators as a model of how to end well. The use of cryptography as a layer of audience engagement, with hidden messages and external puzzles and real-world treasure hunts, has been imitated by other media in fields well outside of children's television. The willingness of the show to treat its villains as funny and its heroes as flawed has become, more or less, a baseline expectation of the genre. Gravity Falls did not invent any of these techniques, but it brought them together in a particular combination on a Disney network at a particular moment, and it found an audience that has carried it forward as a kind of reference point ever since. You can see its fingerprints on a dozen other shows that have come out in the years since it ended, and the people who grew up with it are now, in many cases, working in the same medium, making the shows that will be its successors. There are a small number of mysteries the show leaves entirely unanswered, even after all the cipher decoding and all the supplemental books, and it is worth gathering those together briefly, because the unanswered questions are part of what keeps the show alive in the imagination of its fans years after it ended. The first and probably most discussed is the question of what, exactly. The shapeshifter in the bunker showed Dipper at the end of the bunker episode. The show holds the shape on screen for a single beat, then cuts away, and Dipper never speaks about it again. Fans have spent years interpreting the silhouette, debating whether it was a creature from later in the show, or a piece of Dipper's own future, or simply something the writers wanted to leave hanging. The series to this day has never confirmed an answer. The second is the question of what, exactly, Stanley said to his brother during their long flashback in the past, in the moment of their original fight, when the project model broke. The episode shows you the fight from a kind of distance, and the dialogue you hear is the broad outlines of it. But the show is careful not to give you the actual line that broke the brothers' relationship for 30 years. The line, the writers argue by its absence, is the kind of line that is unrecoverable in the speaker's memory, the kind of thing one twin says to another in the heat of a fight that neither of them can ever quite undo. The third is the question of what, exactly, Wendy will do with the rest of her life, because the show is fairly clear that her teenage stretch is just beginning when the twins leave, and the writers do not particularly pretend to know how it will go. The fourth, and the most haunting, is the question of what happened in the dimension Bill came from before he came to ours. The show implies a great deal. The book confirms much of what was implied, but the actual sequence of events that led Bill from his home dimension to ours, the actual moment of his original sin, the actual face of the family he is alleged to have lost, the show has been content to keep just outside the frame, and the book, even where it elaborates, leaves enough out that the question still has shape. The questions, in aggregate, are part of the experience of the show. The series is content not to answer all of its own mysteries, on the principle, perhaps, that a story that answers everything is no longer quite a mystery. The cultural place of Gravity Falls in the years since it ended has only grown, and the small group of fans who watched it during its original broadcast has expanded, year by year, into a much larger audience that has discovered it on streaming and on home media, and through the slow word of mouth that long-lived cult favorites accumulate. The show's 2 seasons sit in the same shelf as the small handful of other animated series of its era that ended cleanly and remain in steady circulation. And its themes, its tone, its emotional intelligence, and its puzzle layer have aged better than almost any of its peers. The supplemental book, when it was published in 2024, became a bestseller almost immediately. And the response to it from the fan community demonstrated that the audience for Gravity Falls had not only not shrunk in the years since the show ended, but had in fact substantially grown. Whether or not there will ever be additional original screen material in the world of the show is a question that the creator has been deliberately ambiguous about in interviews. He has said that he does not want to ever revisit the world unless he has another story worth telling. He has said that he is not against the idea of telling another story in principle. He has also said that the original twins story, the story of that summer, is over, and that any further screen material would have to do something different. The fan community has spent years speculating about the form a continuation might take. A spin-off following Pacifica. A spin-off following Seuss's adult years running the shack. A spin-off following Wendy's late teenage life. A more direct sequel set in the years after the twins have grown up. None of these have so far been announced. Some of them may yet happen. The show, in the meantime, continues to be exactly the show it always was. No more and no less, and you can sit down with it any night you like and watch the entire run from beginning to end and feel, by the end of the second season, that you have lived through a summer that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last and not a moment longer. If you take the entire show together, the whole arc from the first scene in the woods with the boy and the book to the last scene at the bus station with the twins driving away, what you are looking at is essentially a story about endings. And the great mystery the show eventually solves is the mystery of how to end well. The writers are interested in a dozen kinds of ending. The end of a relationship between brothers and how it can be restarted. The end of a childhood and how it can be walked into instead of clung to. The end of a town's pretense about itself and how it can be survived. The end of a god's reign and how it can be brought about by a small-time grifter willing to give up his mind. The end of a summer and how a summer that ends is somehow more valuable than a summer that does not. The end of a show and how a show that ends on its own terms is somehow more loved than a show that gets renewed indefinitely. The series is, in all of these ways, making one argument over and over. Things end. Things ending is not the same as things being lost. The thing that matters about a thing that ends is what was true about it while it was happening, and what you did while you had it, and who you were with while you were doing it. Bill, who wants to make a universe in which nothing ends, is the show's central villain, because he is, in essence, the enemy of growing up. Mabel, in her bubble, is offered the same bargain in miniature, and the show argues that the bargain is, however generous it looks, a trap. The summer is supposed to end, the portal is supposed to close, the twins are supposed to go home, the brothers are supposed to sail their boat, the shack is supposed to be passed on, the story is supposed to be over, and the rightness of every one of these endings, the fact that each of them is the only good ending available to the people involved, is what gives the show its strange, quiet, deeply felt power. There is one more layer of mystery worth touching on before we leave the town, and that is the small constellation of throwaway visual jokes the show plants in the background of episodes that turn out, on rewatch, to be plot foreshadowing of a kind that no first-time viewer could possibly catch. Gravity Falls is densely populated with these. The Stan O. War model in Stan's office, sitting on the shelf in the very first episode, is the same boat the brothers will eventually plan to sail at the end of the show, and it has been there the whole time, in the background waiting. The photograph of Stan and Stanford as children, sitting in a small wooden frame on Stan's desk, is visible from the pilot episode forward, and most viewers do not even register it as a photograph of two people until the reveal arrives. The six-fingered hand on the cover of Journal 3 is, of course, immediately resonant for any viewer who later returns to the first episode, because the hand and its six fingers are the giveaway of who the author actually is, and the show has been showing it to you in the very first scene. The strange symbols carved into trees and rocks and doorways across the town, visible in the background of episode after episode in the first season, turn out, in the second season, to be the symbols of the Cipher wheel, and you can essentially map the entire structure of the finale by rewinding back through the first season and noting where each symbol has appeared and to which character it was nearest. The triangular shapes embedded everywhere in the visual design of the show, from the architecture of the shack to the necklaces of side characters to the corners of pictures hanging on the walls, are not merely a piece of stylistic affection. They are essentially a low-level reminder through every frame of the show that Bill is already present, already watching, already there. The series is, in this sense, one of the most densely visually authored animated shows of its generation. Almost every frame contains information. Almost every image rewards the second look. The writing is built throughout on the assumption that you will rewatch it, and that you will pay closer attention the second time, and that you will find things the second time that you missed the first time, and that you will go back for a third time after finding the things you missed the second time, and so on in a kind of perpetual rewarding spiral. That, more than any other single design choice, is the reason the show has the cultural staying power it has. Gravity Falls is a show that pays its viewers back for their attention, in a medium that is not always known for paying attention to its viewers in return. The smaller character moments the show plants are also worth taking a final look at, because they are the things that turn the show from a piece of plot into a piece of memory. Mabel knitting, in the background of the early episodes, the same kind of sweater she will eventually give Dipper to wear on the bus home. Stan watching a tape of the old detective show he loves, the same one he tries to share with the kids in the second season and that they politely tolerate. Seuss quietly fixing things around the shack in the background of scenes that are technically about other characters. Wendy reading the same paperback book in different episodes, a small consistent piece of character work the animators apparently kept track of. Dipper writing in his own small notebook, separate from the journal, in scenes the camera does not particularly emphasize. The lake in the middle distance, visible from the windows of the shack at certain times of day. The pine trees in their tens of thousands, breathing in the wind. The way the sky over the valley is almost always either a particular early morning gold or a particular late evening blue, with very little in between. The show, in its smallest atmospheric choices, is constantly insisting that the town is a real place and that the people in it have lives that exceed the plot. That insistence is most of what gives the finale its weight. When the dome falls and the town comes back, you are not just seeing a generic group of townspeople reassemble. You are seeing the sheriff and the deputy, the convenience store cashier, the lumberjack and his daughter, the grumpy farmer and his wife, the children at the park, the diner owner, the news anchor, the postman, all of them, the people you have been watching in the background of every episode for 2 whole seasons, returning to lives you have come to know. The show makes the apocalypse personal. In other words, by making the town personal first. That is the trick of it. That is what most other apocalypse stories miss. The end of a world only matters if you have been shown, with care, the world that is ending. The last small mystery before we close is the mystery of why the show, ending when it ended, has become as quietly important as it has to the generation that grew up with it. There are probably half a dozen serious answers to that question. The series came out during a particular moment in the history of animation in which children's television was being newly taken seriously, and it pushed at the upper limit of what that medium could do. It came out during a particular moment in the cultural conversation about childhood and growing up, and it offered an unusually clear-eyed account of how that conversation actually feels from the inside. It came out during a particular moment in the history of fandom, with the internet making it possible for the first time for thousands of viewers to decode the same cipher together in real time and to share their findings over a long weekend, and the show was specifically designed to reward exactly that kind of collective audience participation. It came out during a particular moment in the small history of the Disney network, when the network was, briefly, willing to commission a slightly more ambitious and slightly more emotionally serious set of shows than it had been making before, and Gravity Falls was the most ambitious and the most emotionally serious of them. The combination of those circumstances, the medium and the moment and the audience and the network, was a rare combination, and the show that emerged from it was a rare show, and the people who happened to be 12 years old when it was broadcast received it as a kind of summer of their own. The show is, for many of those people, an artifact of a specific year of their life, in a way that very little television manages to be. That is why it has held on. That is why the fan community has not dispersed. That is why the Cipher Hunt is still talked about. Why the book sold the way it sold. Why the show is still in steady circulation a decade after it ended. Gravity Falls, in some sense, became a piece of its viewers' own childhoods. And the viewers carry it forward the way they carry the rest of their childhoods forward. And they will, probably, keep carrying it for as long as they live. So that is the summer. That is the town. That is the family, the brothers, the children, the friends, the cosmic horror, the riddle and the trap and the escape. 2 journals hidden in the woods and 1 in the basement. 3 brothers separated for 30 years. Twin children growing up in the space of a single season. A town built on a wound in the world. A god with 1 eye trapped at last in the mind of a small-time grifter. Every mystery the show planted, in the end, finds its place. And the place each one finds is in service of the same quiet argument the show keeps making, over and over, from the first page of the first journal to the last frame of the last episode. The strangeness of the world is real. The bonds between the people in the world are also real.